The Prophecy Club, a nationwide television program, a nationwide radio program. The Prophecy Club also hosts approximately 40 major city meetings per month. Our mission is to inform Christians of current events that confirm Bible prophecy, expose the evil devices of Satan, warn believers what is coming to America, challenge people to stop sinning and turn to Jesus with all their heart, and to provide a platform for Christian speakers to be heard.
It's a bald-faced lie.
Using the positions of power and authority in our own government.
The greatest oil field in the world is at the southwest end of the Dead Sea.
He said, son, you must warn this nation.
And now your host for the Prophecy Club, Stan Johnson.
Welcome to the Prophecy Club, where we provide information and resources with a prophetic warning message to win souls to Jesus and to call people to repentance. In August of 1995, we had Bill Schnoebelen come in. He had gray hair then too, by the way. And he was our guest speaker, one of the early guest speakers. We've had now over 130 of the Prophecy Club. And by the way, I didn't have gray hair then. I don't know why that's coming out. But anyway, and he made a videotape. Then it was 2 hours, correction, two-hour tapes, total 4 hours of information on exposing the Illuminati from within. And it has been one of the most popular videotapes out of the Prophecy Club's 12 years existence, out of those 130 speakers, out of over 250 different titles, and to say when it's consistently been popular through the years with that much competition, that's good. And a couple of months ago, someone suggested that we should have him back to retape it, to update it, and also to make it available now on DVD. And so that's why we're here today. So your topic today is exposing the Illuminati from within. Bill Schnoebelen was a satanic and voodoo high priest. He was a second-degree member of the Church of Satan, a New Age guru, an occultist, a channeler, a 90th degree Mason, a Knight Templar, and a member of the Illuminati. In this particular talk, he's going to show you how the conspiracy works and how it uses the lodge and the highest echelons of power in our country and around the nation, and technology from secret black project operations to form a world government, just like Daniel 7:23 and Revelation 13 says. 13:7 to be specific. Will you help me welcome Bill Schnoebelen? Glad to have you, Bill.
Okay, yes. It is great to be here. And I was very excited when Stan offered the opportunity for me to redo this because a lot of new stuff has come out, a lot of new abilities to produce things that weren't around. It's just amazing the technological things that have happened in the last decade. So I'm real excited about it. From the introduction, I'm sure a lot of you think, how could anybody be that messed up that he would get involved in that many things in one lifetime? Because at that point, I mean, I don't believe in reincarnation, amen? And so I was, doing all this stuff before I got born again, obviously. I stopped doing it then. And so to do all of these things, people say, well, first of all, what made you so evil? Yes, that's a good word for it, evil. Actually, I will try and share what I think the problem was, but I had very good parents. I had no excuses from that standpoint. I mean, I wasn't one of these poor kids that was beaten or locked in a closet or anything like that. I was, very much a Leave It to Beaver kid growing up. In fact, that was my favorite TV show, not that that had anything to do with it, but a couple of things happened. And the first one was essentially that I was out doing the trick-or-treat thing. And back then, this is I was born in 1949, so we're talking like probably 1959, 1960. you never heard anything about Halloween being bad back then. I mean, especially I happen to have been born and raised Catholic, very devout Catholic, and, you know, some of you may not know this, the Catholic Church is actually what brought Halloween to America. So they saw nothing wrong with Halloween. Before the wave of Irish and German immigrants, and I can say this because I'm Irish and German in part, came over here, Halloween was illegal. Did you know that? Most of the 13 colonies and most of the early states, it was illegal. But there was no teaching on that. My parents didn't know anything about it, so they let me go out and do my little thing. And one year, I think it was about 11, 12 years old, I was out walking with my best buddy. It was a beautiful, starry October night, and we were walking down the street. And I just happened to look up in the sky, because I was sort of an astronomy buff even as a kid, and I just was frozen by what I saw, because instead of the sky being full of stars, instead it was like this black cavern. And it was covered with black leathery things from horizon to horizon. And it looked, the only way I can describe it is what I've seen on TV, it's like being inside of a cave that's full of bats. You know, there's just like thousands of bats. Except these things had little red eyes, which I don't think really bats have that feature. And they were staring down at me with these red eyes. And I could feel these eyes like going into my soul, just like burning their way into the very heart of my being. And I felt this thrill, this kind of unclean thrill go through me. I had no idea what it was. And I just sort of stopped, and I was transfixed by this. And I just stared there, and it was almost like I was impaled by those eyes. I couldn't move. And my friend had kept walking, and he stopped and noticed I was kind of going like that. And he said, "Hey, Bill, what's going on?" And I looked at him, and I looked back up at the sky, and the sky was back. There were the stars again. The spell, so to speak, was broken. But from that time on, I began to have a fascination for things outre, for things weird. I started, in fact, believe it or not, by I think the age of 13, I was already involved with getting into UFOs, parapsychology, haunted houses, ESP, all of this stuff. And that's kind of remarkable for someone who was never allowed to see a horror movie, never allowed, I don't think I saw a science fiction movie until I was 14 or 15 years old. Because, of course, back then there wasn't much on TV, and my parents wouldn't let me go to those kind of things. So here I am, I'm getting into all this stuff. Why? And I got really obsessed with UFOs. I mean, I would read everything I get my hands on, which in those days was not an awful lot. I was a member of NICAP, which is the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, which is one of the earlier UFO organizations. And in fact, when my parents would drive around the country on vacation, I'd have to arm wrestle my dad into stopping and visiting all these UFO sites, like or a haunted house, a famous haunted house, or some cemetery where the gravestone moved around, or some bizarre thing or other. I mean, I was addicted to weirdness, let's face it. So, you know, I think that can partially be traced back to that very thing, to the fact that I had, you know, my parents had unwittingly allowed me to walk out on a night which is considered by Satanists to be the devil's birthday, and to be out there unprotected, because it never occurred to my parents to pray for me before I went out the door on Halloween night. And I was out there unprotected. So then, the next thing that happened is even at that point, from the time I was a youngster, I wanted to be a Catholic priest. That was my avid desire. I mean, so bad that when I was a little kid, I would actually cut up my mother's bed sheets and color them to make them into vestments. So I had it bad. And so I went to Loras College, which was the minor seminary college in Iowa for, you know, people that want to be a priest. Now, an interesting thing, you know, a funny thing happened on the way to the priesthood, as they say. What happened was there was a professor of theology, because, of course, if you're going to be a priest, you take theology courses. And there was a professor of theology, a layman, who nevertheless had a PhD. And he started telling us all how, first of all, got to understand this, the Catholic Church teaches that the priest is another Christ. In other words, when you go up on that altar and you hold up the host, or you hold up the chalice and you say, "For this is my body," or "For this is the blood of the new covenant," you know, etc., you are acting as Christ at that moment. You are literally Jesus Christ, quote unquote, at that moment. And so, he said, well, if you want to be like Christ, this professor told us, you have to do the kind of stuff Christ did. And that made sense, And then he says, well, you know what Jesus did? He went out and studied under the gurus in India. He went to Egypt and studied under the Magi. He studied with the lamas in Tibet, and he told this story about how there's this monastery where we have all these scrolls that talk about this wise person that came to Tibet called Isa, and that Isa was actually Jesus. And so he said, if you want to be like Christ, if you want to be another Christ, then you have to learn these occult techniques. This is how Jesus turned water into wine. This is how Jesus healed people, walked on water, etc. So, what did I know? I was like 18 or 19 years old. This guy was, had a PhD, and he was a highly respected professor. So I started going out and getting books on the occult, which were few and far between. I actually had to join an occult book of the month club in order to get them, because anywhere in the town I was living in Dubuque, there was nothing. And I finally got a hold of a book on witchcraft, and it was by a lady named Sybil Leek. And she was the first female witch to come out and actually teach that witchcraft is a religion. That it isn't just, like the Wizard of Oz, this green ugly lady with warts, who flies around a broomstick and goes, like that. No. That witches are actually a religious group, just like Buddhists are, just like Jews are, just like whatever. And so that intrigued me, because it looked like here's a religion that as part of its religious practice actually teaches you how to be psychic, how to do these things. And especially when I read in some witchcraft book that Jesus was a witch, that he had his coven of 12 apostles, and because there's a coven of 13, that's the size of a witch coven, and that each of the apostles had a working partner who was a woman, and that Jesus, of course, had Mary Magdalene. Now this is like 40 years ago, so all this foo-for-ah about the Da Vinci Code or whatever, well, we knew about this stuff 40 years ago. So anyway, I decided I got to be a witch. I was about a sophomore in college at this point. I wrote to the king of the witches. I figured, hey, let's go right to the top, right? And his name was Alex Sanders, and he was a high-level witch in London, and he gave me the address of a nearby coven where I could go and be initiated, because witchcraft is an initiatic religion. You have to go and have someone sort of, kind of zap you to get into witchcraft. So this is an example of me when I was in college practicing witchcraft. Some people say I looked like Jerry Garcia, but I don't know if I think that's a compliment or not. Anyhow, as you can see, I was kind of the typical hippie witch, this is actually taken because I was also making movies at the time, and this was a portrait for the film I was directing. While in college, I did all sorts of things which I don't have time to go into, but I learned how to do trance mediumship. I learned how to do even like occult exorcisms, things like that. So it was a pretty wild ride. By the time I was I think a senior in college, I decided I didn't want to be a Catholic priest anymore. Big surprise. For one thing, I'd been at the St. Rose Priory at that time. Was a Dominican seminary in Dubuque, and the guy there was actually practicing the occult. The professors were doing ceremonial magic and thaumaturgy. In fact, how many of you have heard of Matthew Fox? Anybody? Guess not. Well, you're probably not up on apostate teachers. Matthew Fox is a very popular writer among very liberal Catholics and Episcopalians and New Agers. And he's the one who coined the term creation spirituality. Creation spirituality is the worship of the earth and the worship of sexuality. It's a kind of an academic word for witchcraft. Well, he was at this seminary at that time. He was a Dominican priest. About, I think, 10 or 12 years ago, he was kicked out of the Dominican order by the Roman Church for being a heretic, but the Episcopalians took him in. So anyway, I'll just let that drop and you can decide what you want about it. So I decided I didn't want to do the celibacy thing, because I was reading all this stuff in witchcraft about how you have to have a man and a woman, male and female, yin and yang, goddess and god, you know, so I figured I didn't want to spend my life being celibate. And so I took a leave of absence when I graduated from college and instead became a music teacher. And oddly enough, in a Catholic school. So here I was, a practicing witch, teaching music in a Catholic high school. And I had a pentagram around my neck, and you know, I wore it on top of my necktie and everything every day to work. And I taught the nuns how to do yoga and astrology, and I was giving, you know, tarot card readings at the church fairs to raise money for the school. And can't imagine why they ultimately fired me, can you? Anyway, they only fired me after I raised so much money for them. I don't know. Anyhow, along the way, while I was teaching there, I was doing all this magic because I needed a working partner. I needed a priestess. And I ran into my wife. This is a picture taken of her at that time, Sharon. And I put some of these pictures in here because some people have claimed I really don't have a Sharon. I just made her up to make me look better, you know, because they say, well, she never comes with you, she never speaks, you know, whatever. And I say, here she is, this is Sharon. So, you know, now you know what she looks like. At this time, we already had a coven of 6 members. This was in 1972. This is a picture of me drawing down the moon on Sharon. That's a ritual that's done where basically you believe the moon goddess comes down and possesses the high priestess of the coven, and then she speaks like an oracle to the people, and it's done every full moon. This is our wedding. We were married in 1974 in a witch wedding. Our wedding cake was a Vulcan Idic, for those of you that might have been into Star Trek at some point. That's the sacred symbol of the planet Vulcan. And we, of course, blurred out the faces of some of the people present because we didn't want to have them get mad at me. This is our wedding portrait. The guy in black there was one of the major leading witches in Milwaukee, although this actually was done in a park in Dubuque. You can see we're both kind of the quintessential flower children, you know, with flowers in our hair and green robes and all of that kind of stuff. So that was, and then at that point, we went and went down and studied in Arkansas for a while under the Grand Master Druid of North America. And he's the one that actually taught us a lot of the other things we needed to get into, because he highly recommended that I should get involved with Freemasonry, that I should get involved with Mormonism if I had an opportunity, that these were organizations were full of occult Luciferian knowledge if one knew how to manipulate it. This is a post-wedding portrait of Sharon. I just put that in there because I'm so proud of my wife. It doesn't have anything to do with the occult, but I just think she's a cutie. Anyhow, still do. Anyway, so we moved to Milwaukee in 1974 because there were 80 people there that wanted us to train them how to be witches. And so we went there, and partly because I couldn't get a job in Dubuque. It was a bad period in the economy. And so we had class after class after class where we were teaching people witchcraft. And we were the ancillary stuff too, you know, astrology, tarot cards, mediumship, parapsychology, astral travel. And we just, you know, we were virtually a little free university. We'd have a semester and we'd have about 10 or 15 people. We'd train them and then we'd run them through. And then and I see you can only have 13 members in a coven. And so we set up 2 or 3 different covens, and Sharon became a witch queen, which means someone who has a high priestess who has several covens under her. One of the people in the coven at that time happened to have a dad who was the junior warden of a Masonic lodge in Heartland, Wisconsin. Now, a junior warden is like one of the top 3 officers in a local Masonic body. And so I thought, well, this high-level druid, the Grand Master of all druids in North America, whose name, oddly enough, was Eli, he said if I ever had an opportunity to join the Masons, do so. So I had said, well, can this guy get me into the Masons? And so he did. And you see there, that's my certificate for, I don't know how well you can see it, but all of these things are in my books if you want to see better documentation. On March 24th, 1977, I was finally raised to the sublime degree of a Master Mason. which is the top of the Blue Lodge degrees. Subsequently, I went on and went through York Rite, went through Scottish Rite, and went through the Shrine. So basically, I did essentially everything one could do in Masonry, and even some stuff that most people can't do in Masonry, as we'll see later. Along the way, now this might seem a radical change of direction, but a funny thing happened to me. I had just been made a high priest of the Druidic order. I was a high priest of witchcraft, and we were down in Chicago visiting some friends at the Temple of the Pagan Way, which is another occult organization. Chicago is full of them. Anyway, we all got together, and guess what movie was playing at that time? Big, huge movie, The Exorcist. And so we thought, oh, this will be a kick. Let's go see the movie. And so there were like 3 sets of high priest, high priestess witches. 3 couples, plus the guy who was the head of the Temple of the Pagan Way in Chicago. And we all sat in this theater, and we were all scared to death. I mean, it was so funny because this lady who was sitting next to me, who wasn't Sharon, she was like another high priestess, she grabbed my hand in this like death grip and wouldn't let it go for the whole movie. And I don't know if any of you have defiled your minds by seeing that film, but that is probably the evilest movie ever made. And it was so profoundly scary and evil, for reasons I don't have time to go into, that the fellow who we were staying with down there, who happened to be an epileptic, he actually had a grand mal seizure that night. It had hit his nervous system that violently. And it kind of scared me, and I thought, well, gee, maybe I should do something with this Catholic thing. I'd kind of put the whole Catholic scene aside. Well, as it happens, I heard through a friend of mine who ran an occult bookstore that there was an old Roman Catholic church in town. Now, probably none of you even heard of the old Roman Catholic Church. But what it is, it's a branch of the Church of Utrecht in Holland, which was cut away from the Vatican by various Protestant Catholic divisions back in the 1700s. And so this has existed as a whole separate parallel church to the Catholic Church. The only difference is 1, they allow a married clergy, 2, they say the Mass in the vernacular, and 3, they do not accept the last 2 councils, in other words, Vatican I or Vatican II. So this fellow was willing to ordain me, get me ordained to the priesthood, in exchange for me ordaining him a witch priest. So he kind of, swapped initiations. So this is a picture of me. This is actually during the ordination ceremony this is in St. Paul's Church, Old Catholic Church in Joliet, Illinois. There's my certificate, June 5th, 1976. I already explained about the Roman Rite of Utrecht. This is another shot of the same thing where I'm kneeling. The bishop there is about to lay hands on me. Notice his little Dagon fish hat that he's wearing. That's very important. Okay, so, and all this, you see, it was like I was gathering power. This is how I looked at it, because, see, this Druid guy had explained to me that there's all these different currents of occult power. And I explain all this in my book, Lucifer Dethroned, but like for all of the, you have the 13 members of Jesus' coven, right? And each one of those apostles had a certain current of power that went out from him. Like, for example, the Johannine current of power was the Freemasons. The Petrine current for Peter was the Roman Church, and so on and so on and so on. And so it was like I was going around picking up these things, sort of like, hash marks on my spiritual aura or whatever. So that's what I was doing. I wasn't just being, people might think, well, what kind of a wacko person is a witch and goes and is ordained a Catholic priest? Well, it's not as strange as you think, and we'll explore more about that later. Anyhow, once I'd gone this far, another thing happened. This same friend who stood up at my wedding as my best man, he owned this occult bookstore in Milwaukee I referred to, and he said, one day he came up to me and he says, you really ought to read this book. And he handed me a copy of the Satanic Bible. Now, if you talk to anybody who's a white witch, they'll say, oh, witches aren't Satanists, witches don't believe in Satan, we worship nature. We're out skipping through the woods, gathering herbs and worshiping the gentle goddess and the great God, tra-la-la. So, this was sort of odd because this guy was supposedly a Wiccan. But he said, this guy has some good ideas. So I read the book, and I found out that indeed Anton LaVey, who wrote the Satanic Bible, the guy who was the head of the Church of Satan for many years, that he did have some interesting ideas. And you see, this is how it works. Once you set your foot in this direction, you know, you get more deceived, you get more deceived. You know, it's not like I woke up, you know, one morning when I was a high school kid and said, I want to worship the devil. You know, it was a gradual process. And especially when you understand that the Church of Satan doesn't worship the devil. How many of you realize that? The Church of Satan does not worship the devil. They just view the devil as a symbol, as an archetype. Now, there are, of course, Satanists that do worship the devil, but that's why basically we call the Church of Satan comic opera Satanism, because it's really not that serious a thing. Not that it's not dangerous, but compared to other forms of Satanism, it's not that dangerous. So I went through the first degree of the Church of Satan, and then made it all the way up to second degree. You'll notice there, that's my certificate. I was made a warlock in the Church of Satan. You'll notice there down at the bottom is Anton LaVey's autograph. I have the dubious distinction of having his autograph. I want to note that in the last paragraph, it says, the Church of Satan, having passed before the Council of Nine, order of the trapezoid, by all the powers of hell, so it is done. That's kind of like saying amen. Well, notice that order of the trapezoid, because that's going to be important later. This is what set me on what occultists call the left-hand path. And from then on, I was both pursuing Masonry and many other things, and still doing the Catholic priest thing, but I was also doing the satanic thing. Now, you might think, how could anybody do that at the same time? Well, you've got to realize, first of all, once you get past the basic Satanism of Anton LaVey's church, you discover that in order to be a practicing satanic priest, you first of all have to be a Catholic priest. Did you realize that? Now, this is not intended as a slam on Catholicism, although there's certainly a talk there somewhere. But the problem is that, you see, the classical black mass, les messes noires in the French, is a ritual that's an inversion of the Catholic ceremony, the Catholic liturgy that you've all probably seen pictures of if you've not actually attended one. And except they have the cross upside down, the priest wears dark vestments, and they have a naked woman on the altar. And what they do is they believe that the host is really the body of Jesus. And so they abuse this host. They stomp on it, they urinate on it, they do things I won't even describe to it, and they believe by doing that they're torturing Jesus. Now this is bizarre, I know, but this is what they believe. And so it's really handy if you can have a priest there to do his hocus pocus. Now, how many of you realize the word hocus pocus comes from the Latin Mass? Did you know that? It was a thing that Protestants came up with to make fun of Catholics, because the words in Latin, the priest picks up the host and he says, for this is my body. And what that is Latin is hoc est inem corpus meum. So it's like hocus pocus. And the idea that you say this as a priest, and poof, this piece of bread turns into the body of Jesus. Body, blood, soul, and divinity. And ditto with the wine. So anyway, then if you were actually a Catholic priest who was also a satanic priest, you could do the satanic mass, have the host right there, and you could abuse it to your heart's content, and thereby thinking you were somehow insulting, you know, Jesus Christ up in heaven. So it's not as bizarre as you think. If you look at the history of Satanism, most of the prominent Satanists were also Catholic priests or Catholic bishops. I'll just name two. Aleister Crowley, some of you may have heard of him. He was consecrated a bishop in the old Roman Church. And also Anton LaVey. Believe it or not, he ended up doing the same thing I did. He got a Greek Orthodox bishop, who shall remain nameless, to consecrate him a bishop in return for him making the Greek Orthodox bishop a priest of Satan. So it gets kind of fuzzy here, folks. Now here you see me in my ceremonial magical garb. I was involved in all sorts of high-level magic, including thalamic magic, which means magic that's based on the works of Aleister Crowley, who was the most prominent black magician of the last century. and Enochian magic, which has nothing to do with like Enoch in the Bible. It's a very complicated thing that was brought forth by Dr. John Dee, who was the original 007. Have you heard of Dr. John Dee? He was Queen Elizabeth I. This is way back 400 years ago. Queen Elizabeth's premier spy. And he was also a high-level occultist, an alchemist, and a ceremonial magician. And she would send him into Europe to spy on different countries, and he would send missives back, and he'd always sign his name 007. That was his little code designation. That's where Ian Fleming got the thing for James Bond. So anyhow, see all this interesting trivia you're picking up here? Anyway, at this time I was also a member of the Brotherhood, and that's hardcore Satanism. See, if you think of it like this, you could think of the Church of Satan as kind of like marijuana, and hardcore Satanism is like cocaine or acid or heroin or something. So it's like a gateway into deeper, darker levels of the occult. And along the way, I had to sign my name in the black book. I had to sell my soul to the devil. I didn't know the devil already had my soul, but you know, I made a pact. And the pact was that for 7 years, I would serve Satan faithfully, that he would have me body, soul, and spirit. He would give me anything I requested: wine, women, song, drugs, power, whatever I wanted I could have. In exchange for that, at the end of 7 years, he'd get to kill me and take me to hell. What a deal. How many of you want to sign up? You got to realize, Satanists are taught that there's this kind of, I don't know if you've heard of the philosopher Nietzsche, but Nietzsche taught that Christians were like slave mentality, and that the true masters were the Ubermen, the supermen. And so the idea was that Christians were all losers. They would go to heaven, which is boring because you sit around all day and twang on a harp while sitting on a cloud and saying, oh, you're so great, oh, you're so wonderful, you know, and it's boring. That's what we were told. Whereas if you go to hell, it's like sex, drugs, rock and roll, day and night for all eternity. You get to party hardy for all eternity. And so the masters go to hell. The slaves go to heaven. The wolves go to hell. The sheep go to heaven. That's the way we looked at it. In fact, I was taught at one point, think of it this way: what's the greatest thing a Christian can do for the Lord? Think about it. To be a martyr. To give your life for the faith. Because the word martyr means witness. That's what it literally means in Greek. And at the same time, this Satanist leader said to me, what's the greatest thing a Satanist can do? Is kill a Christian. So it's like a symbiotic relationship, just like the wolf kills the sheep. So the Satanist kills the Christian. And the Christian gets his great blessings, and the Satanist gets his great blessings. It's a win-win situation. Now you see how twisted all this is? You see, but there's enough truth in it to sell it. Anyway, I got more and more into these things, very, very strange stuff going on. At one point, I'd gone through different levels of initiation in ceremonial magic, and I'd done some very powerful rituals, and I had this experience. I had happened to go home to visit, because this time we were living in Milwaukee, and I'd gone home to visit my folks who lived in a little farm town in Iowa, and I was staying in my old bedroom, and for some reason Sharon hadn't come with me. And all of a sudden, I felt like I was lifted out of my bed, carried through the roof of my bedroom, and I was sailing through the sky, through the stars, to the moons of Saturn. Now, that's pretty weird. And mind you, I was not on any drugs at this point. No funny cigarettes or recreational vegetables whatsoever. And I ended up landing on this moon of Saturn, and there was this obscenely bizarre-looking temple there. It was all totally black, totally out of whack. The angles were all wrong, spikes sticking out of it. It looked like a loathsome, diseased kind of black thing crouching on the plains of this moon. And I was told to go in, and I went inside, and there was this gentleman there who was my occult mentor, and he was wearing a white robe, and he kind of glowed in the dark like Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Star Wars movies, you know. Well, anyhow, he says, welcome to the Cathedral of Pain. Now, somehow that didn't sound very good. to me, but what could I do? I was out in the middle of outer space, you know. And so I walk into this thing, and it's an enormous thing like a cathedral, just huge, except instead of stained glass windows along the walls, there was these, like, imagine like giant aquariums, floor-to-ceiling aquariums, full of some kind of fluid in this green light bathing them, and except instead of pictures or whatever, floating in these two aquariums on both sides of the room were countless naked dead bodies, mutilated, horrible looking, you know, just floating there, including dead babies, dead children, dead adults, the whole bit. And I was just getting horrible feelings about this. There was this altar which was shaped like a trapezoid made out of girders in the middle of the room, and there was this huge throne made out of steel girders in the far side of this cathedral, kind of like if you were in like a Anglican or Catholic church, you know, in the rear. Well, what happened was I was told to lay down on this altar, and they tied me to this altar, and this is all happening in this dream. Was it a dream? I don't know. What happens? All these people come out in black robes and they start chanting, and for some reason they're chanting in French. And for some reason I understand French even though I don't. And they're saying all these blasphemous things against the Almighty, which I won't even repeat, just cursing over and over again. And it's like they're trying to raise a level of power. And all of a sudden this figure materializes on this throne in the rear of this huge cathedral. And it's this giant ghastly figure, probably 25, 30 feet high. And it's like scintillating back and forth between this gorgeous looking man with long flowing hair to becoming like a winged bull, to becoming like a goat with wings and a human body. And it would go back and forth, like scintillating. So at the end, this thing gets up off the throne, and the chanting is getting more and more fierce and more frenzied. And he comes down, and every time he steps, the whole floor shakes. And he comes up to where I'm laying on this altar, and he has this vast hand that's like, 4 feet long, from thumb to finger, and talons. And he takes this finger and he pokes it right through my forehead, like this talon, and it like sears into my brain, and I feel this energy just burning my brain with white hot pain. And he said in this cavernous, sepulchral Darth Vader type voice, "Now you belong to me, body, soul, and spirit forever." And my brain like exploded at that point, and I felt myself hurtling back to earth in a fireball. And I landed in the backyard of my parents' house. I'm laying there stark naked in the middle of this burning circle of fire on the lawn. And I had a scar on my forehead, which is still faintly visible to this day, 20 years later. And it was like, whoa, what happened here? And I kind of staggered back into the house. I had the mother of all headaches, and I didn't know what to make of it. But from then on, that was my Luciferian initiation, even though I didn't know it at the time. Soon after that, I was invited to join the Illuminati. Now, what's the Illuminati? Well, we're going to talk about it a lot tonight, but basically it's the mother of all conspiracies. And it means literally a society of illuminated men and women who have received the light of Lucifer. Because remember, Lucifer means the light bearer, right? So anyway, I was walking around in this state of white fog in my brain, and I was getting more and more tempted to do evil things, more and more. It was like whatever vestige of humanity was gradually being eaten away by this cancer of evil. So then I got to the point of what's called the abyss in high-level magic, where you have to cross the abyss. And then you transcend good and evil, and you're on the final approach to becoming a living God. And in order to do that, I had to make a choice. In the system of magic I was working, I had two choices. I could either be a werewolf or a vampire. Now, a lot of you might think, huh? This guy's been, eating too many stale pizzas or what? But no, I had to make that choice. And I knew people who'd been into lycanthropy, which is the technical medical term for being a werewolf, and I knew it hurt a lot. I mean, you think about it. I mean, your nose starts growing out, and you grow like 2 feet taller, and this and that and the other thing. So it's not very fun. Plus, the stuff you have to do to become a werewolf, the rituals are so unspeakable, I won't even offend your ears by telling you what they are. So I'd always kind of had this fascination for vampires anyhow, because they're kind of sexy and everything, you know. So I thought, okay, I can do that. I can be a vampire. So I was ultimately initiated into a vampire cult down in a Russian Orthodox splinter group in Chicago, and I started having all of these sort of semi-vampiric symptomologies, like I couldn't go out in sunlight, I couldn't get within 50 feet of garlic, because garlic's a blood purifier, you see. And I had to sleep in a specially designed coffin. I mean, and I'm sure you're all thinking about this, but this guy's a total wacko. Well, no, and if you look around what's happening today, I mean, I was doing this stuff in 1978. What's going on today is you're seeing a whole culture developing of vampires. You may have seen, like, they have programs on them, like on the History Channel or the Discovery Channel. There's vampire nightclubs. There's vampire churches. They're out in the open, which was then secret 25 years ago, is now out in the open. And people ask, well, what did you do? How did you survive? Well, the funny thing is I couldn't eat anything. I couldn't even drink water. Water would just sit in my stomach like molten glass. The only thing I could do was every day I would celebrate a Catholic Mass and take communion. And then about once or twice a week, with increasing frequency, I had women in my coven who were willing to let me bite them in their neck and drink blood. And so that was how I survived for more than a year. I mean, I probably didn't have more than, 40 calories a day. And yet I survived. It's all satanic. It's all demonic. And I believed that if I were to die, I would rise from the grave 3 days later as a vampire. And see, this group taught me that Lazarus was the first vampire in the New Testament, in the book of John, and that Jesus was initiating people into vampirism. They said, why do you think Jesus said that, if you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you will live forever? See how the devil can take something and twist it? Or Jesus' statement that there are some standing here right now that will not taste death until they see the kingdom of heaven coming. And that enigmatic thing at the end of John's gospel, where it talks about what is it to you if I want the beloved disciple, who we understand to be John, to tarry until I come, meaning the second advent. And so these people actually said that the head of this whole vampire cult was the Apostle John, who is now 2,000 years old, and he was a vampire. So I'm going, and it makes sense in a weird, twisted sort of way if you don't know your Bible, if you don't understand the Scriptures. And again, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And of course, I never got any theological training, even though I went through a Catholic college, even though I went through as part of my priesthood training and got a master's degree in Catholic theology from a Roman Catholic seminary. I never read the epistles of Paul. I knew the gospel story vaguely, and oddly enough, I was fascinated with the book of Revelations. I kept reading it and reading it and reading it, but I couldn't understand it. It was like, of course, I'm not saying I understand it now completely either, amen, but I mean, it was a very hard book to get at. And so I didn't know what I was doing, and I was being deceived. Moving along, I finally got involved with a group called the Ecclesia Gnostica Spiritualis, which is an old Catholic group, and the guy who was the head of that, who was probably the evilest man I've ever met, he consecrated me a bishop. And at the same time, I was raised to the 90th degree of Egyptian Freemasonry, which is the ancient and primitive rite of Memphis Missouri. I mean, I know you probably can't see that certificate very well, which is just as well because it's in French. Anyway, on that, it's available in a better format that you can see, and I think it's in Lucifer Dethroned. Soon after that, now this is ironic, in regular American Masonry, I went through the Scottish Rite. And this is my degree certificate for being made a member of the Scottish Rite. Then I was went to the Shriner. Can you imagine this? This is me as a Shriner. I don't think you can see that picture that well, but I'm wearing the funny little fez thing and everything, and It's the ancient Arabic order of the nobles of the mystic shrine. And I don't know how many of you realize this, but I'm sure if you go to some large city like Kansas City, they have some big fancy shrine temple, and you hear about the wonderful hospitals for crippled children and blah, blah, blah. But when Shriners become Shriners, they swear an oath in the name of Allah, and they swear it on the Quran. So it is not anywhere near a Christian organization. None of Masonry is. See, Masonry was part of the deception that drew me into all of this. But that's a whole other talk. I'm going to get into that in a few minutes. My second last step was I became a Mormon, and let me tell you how that happened. Mormon? You know, what's this? Well, as I said, I was into this vampire thing. I was getting, you see, vampirism, let me tell you, there's a reason why Yahweh God tells us do not drink blood. He said that to Noah, he said that to Moses, and it's even in the book of Acts in chapter 15. Because blood is the ultimate addiction. Because the blood is the life. And I had to keep drinking more of it, and more of it, and more of it. And I was saying Mass every day, and it got to the point where like 3 or 4 times a week, I had to have one of the women in my coven let me bite them in the neck. And once I got so carried away with bloodlust, I took too much, and I had the girl pass out on me, which was pretty scary. Fortunately, my wife has a lot of nursing training, and she was able to tell nothing was seriously wrong. She just sort of had an attack of pernicious anemia. But at the time, the only job I had, because, you know, what do you do when you can't go out in the daytime? I was working as a boxman for the Milwaukee Sentinel, which meant I drove around in the middle of the night and put the newspapers in boxes for the morning newspaper. And I drive, you know, you're driving through the streets of Milwaukee at 2 in the morning, who do you see? Mainly prostitutes and the occasional homeless person. And I was white-knuckling it on the steering wheel. I was so trying to fight off the urge, just jump out of my truck, pounce on one of these hookers, and just rip her throat out. It was getting that bad. And I was just, what am I supposed to do here? What am I supposed to do? And the funny thing is along the way, I asked for help. And I was asking for it from the devil. But the funny thing is sometimes Yahweh will come along when you're praying to the wrong deity, and he'll say, excuse me, I'll take this call. And that's just what he did. He answered that prayer. Because what happened is that all of a sudden, I got a check back. Every year I was sending a check to the Church of Satan, my dues. And I got it back from the bank, and some lady from the San Francisco bank, where the Church of Satan does its banking, had written on it, I'll be praying for you in the name of Jesus. And I just thought that was so inane, because at this point I was so deceived. I thought Jesus was the son of Satan. He'd been killed on the cross as a sacrifice to the evil God, Jehovah, to save mankind from enslavement. That's how 180 degrees off I was. So I just laughed and, you know, forgot about it. Well, the funny thing was, within a couple days, something hit me like a Mack truck. I lost all my magical power. I got sick as a dog. I lost all my vampiric power. It was like I was flat on my face. You know, I felt like I was hitting bottom big time. And I couldn't figure out what was going on, you know. And so I kept saying, you know, Lucifer, you promised me that if I did all these things for you, I would have all this power, all of this wealth, women, whatever, you know. And here I am basically ruined. You know, because that's what he is. He's a welcher. The devil will promise you anything and then deliver virtually nothing. And the funny thing is, who should come up from from Chicago to visit us in Milwaukee? A couple of teenage satanic groupies who wanted to meet the great Magister Templi, that was me, who at that time I was so sick as a dog I could barely sit in my chair and look impressive. And so they came in and they said, well, we brought you these Christian comic books because they're so funny. There's one book called Spellbound and one book called Angel of Light, and they're about the occult, and they're so stupid, you know. And they'd even written obscene things in them and like made black the teeth out on the characters in the book and stuff. So anyway, I just glanced at them, couldn't be bothered. The interesting thing is in all those years, we lived 10 years in Milwaukee, no Christian ever came and witnessed to us. Not even a Jehovah's Witness came and witnessed to us. Not even the Mormons came to visit us. We lived in the same place in the heart of downtown Milwaukee. Never. So that's what Yahweh had to do. He had to have Satanists bring me the gospel. Because at that time, still to this day, in the back of those comic books was how to get born again. But I couldn't be bothered. I had too much ego. You know, they say it's the hardest thing of all is for someone who's prideful to get saved. And I was full of pride. Even though I was flat on my face, I was full of pride. Well, what's funny is once I rejected that, there's a knock on the door about a day later. We open the door, and it's Mormon missionaries. Now, the funny thing is that this high-level Druid guy, I alluded to this earlier, he told me, and if I ever got in trouble, that we should join the Mormon church because their church was started by witches for witches, as a place where you could hang out and appear to be this very square, straight, white-bread, Republican, conservative, Christian-type person, and it believe almost all the same things witches do. And so we thought, well, this is our answer to, prayer, quote-unquote. So we joined the LDS Church in 1980, went to the Salt Lake Temple in 1981. That's a whole other story we don't have time for. I became an Elders Quorum president in 1982. You'll notice there the graphic is my last temple recommend. That's like your American Express card for the Celestial Kingdom in Mormonism. Because if you can't go to the temple, you're damned. And this is a special card that allowed me to go to the temple and do work for the dead and to get my own endowments so I could be married for time and eternity to my wife, etc., etc. So this is just sort of documentation. Yes, I was indeed in the Mormon church. However, I tell people, if Yahweh can use a donkey to preach, he can even get someone saved by using the Mormon church. Because for the first time in my life, as a Mormon, I was trying to be good. Well, I should say since I was a kid. Because if you're a witch, you don't worry about breaking the 10 Commandments. If you're a Satanist, you want to break at least one a day. But for the first time in my life, I was trying to be a good Christian, because Mormons have very high standards. They're very much like the same ethics, the same morality as what any Christian church will teach you. But what I didn't realize is you can't try to be a Christian. Amen? It's like sleeping in a garage and thinking you're a Cadillac. You can't do it. Either you are a Christian or you aren't a Christian. And it's by faith. It's not by how many good deeds you can rack up. Because, see, the Mormon church has over 4,000 commandments it has to keep to be a good Mormon. The 613 commandments that are in the Torah aren't enough. They added another 3,400 whatever. So, I was buried in trying to be righteous. And I realized I couldn't do it. And then what happened was they called me to be a professional teacher of theology for the Church Institute of Religion. And they asked me to teach a course in the New Testament. Now, the Mormons use the King James Bible. See, I tell people, even a broken clock is right twice a day, amen? So everybody gets something right. And so here I am for the first time in my life. I'm like 34 years old. I'm actually reading the Bible from cover to cover. I'm actually reading Paul's epistles. And I read Galatians, and I read Romans, and I realized there was no way Paul could have been a Mormon. And so I wrestled, and I struggled, and I prayed, and I fasted, and this is a longer story that I want to get into. But ultimately, I studied my way out of the LDS Church, and finally, on June 22nd, 1984, I remembered those comic books. And I figured I'd tried everything else. I might as well try this. And so I took off my magic Mormon underwear because I didn't want any static on the line when I prayed. And I got the comic book out and put it on the bed and knelt at the foot of the bed and prayed the sinner's prayer, quote unquote. And at that moment, Yeshua, Jesus, saved me from my sins and became the Lord of my life. Hallelujah. Amen. Let's give him a praise offering for that. So, that is quite a long story, and yet I wanted you to understand how deception works and how it's a gradual process. And yet from the moment that lady started praying for me, I started moving on an upward trajectory. Because Mormonism, as bad as it is a vast improvement over being a Satanist. Amen? Okay, now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty stuff here. That was just lightweight stuff. We're going to explain about the Illuminati and its origins. Essentially, anytime you study, and let me just say this, anybody who says that there isn't a conspiracy out there, and you get this all the time, even from Christians, oh, you're a conspiracy nut, blah, blah, blah. And they obviously don't know the Bible from a doorknob, because you can see the history of a conspiracy, both in the celestial realm with Satan himself and his minions, and down here on the earth, tracked all through both testaments. And even the second Psalm, about the kings of the earth conspiring against the Lord and against his anointed. I mean, this is a conspiracy. So if anybody says, oh, you're just a conspiracy nut, you can just say, hallelujah, thank you. And then explain why you're thanking them. Anyhow, you can't study this conspiracy without studying Freemasonry. See, Masonry, while itself is kind of benign in some ways, I mean, it's not like, and I don't want, by any of this, I'm not wanting you to think that, oh, Satanists are running around cutting up cats or killing people or, torturing, because most Masons are nice people. They're just deceived to their toenails. But they're not evil people, except in the sense that we're all evil people until we get saved. But Masonry has been like the carrier wave, if you understand radio, upon which the conspiracy has traveled down through the millennia. It's been called many things. It's been called the Dionysian artificers. It's been called the Gnostics, etc., etc. We'll get into more of that in a little bit. But Masonry traces its own history back, of all things, to the Tower of Babel. They claim Nimrod was the greatest Mason who ever lived after the flood. Before the flood, they associate the origin of the original Mason with Tubal-Cain, who is one of the I think he's the 7th generation down from Cain, and he was the guy that invented metalworking and blacksmithing and things like that. Now it's interesting, way back when I did this talk in 1995, I said this. Since Nimrod, Masonry has always been the matrix of all secret societies. Of course, now we all know this movie, The Matrix, and its sequels is a big thing. Everybody talks about it. But you see, you know what the word matrix means? It actually means womb. That's literally what it means. And the matrix is the womb, the crucible, the place in which the conspiracy is formed. Another kind of synonym for matrix is like a mold. Like if you're doing metal or plastic, or you have molten material and you pour it into this mold, that's a matrix. So that's what the word matrix actually means, and that's exactly what Masonry has been down through the centuries. It's like you can take a mold and you can pour, molten gold into it and make a gold whatever, or some of you may even be into hunting and you make your own bullets and you pour the molten lead into a little thingy, and I know nothing about this, but I know there's guys that make their own shells and their own whatever. And it's the same idea. You can take that same mold and pour something else in it. You can pour molten silver in it. And it's the same with Masonry. Masonry is the matrix, and you can pour, whether it doesn't matter what it is, different things into it. And that way it's like a virus which comes down through the century and it mutates to meet the needs of the time. Its most effective work is always done in secret, and it always appears outwardly respectable. Now, what I want you to understand here as we talk about this is you want to watch out for the leaven. What do I mean by that? Well, Yeshua warned us in Matthew 16 to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, leaven in Hebrew is chametz, and basically it is a symbol of wickedness. You'll notice Paul also says this in 1 Corinthians 5, 6 through 8. He said, your glorying is not good. Know ye not that a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump? Purge out therefore the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, for as you are unleavened. Notice the whole symbolism there with the Passover. Even as Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast not with the old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Okay, now, you got to understand the idea here. And some of you may have studied the Passover in terms of its symbolism, because it's very, very rich. And part of the idea is that you're not supposed to eat leaven for a period of 8 days following the actual feast of Pesach, the feast of Passover. And some of you may know that Orthodox devout Jews will actually go through their house and make sure there's not a lick of leaven in it. They'll look in every nook and cranny, every cupboard. They'll clean everything out scrupulously. And this is a metaphor. This is like a symbol of them getting their lives cleaned up. Because again, leaven is wickedness. And this is what Paul is talking about here in 1 Corinthians. He's referring to this very thing. And it's important to understand that this chametz, this leaven, is something that is not readily seen. If any of you have made bread, you know, you sprinkle this yeast in it. It's like this little fine powder. And then what do? You work the dough. You knead the dough. And I've watched my wife do this. I've even done it with her, you know. And after a few minutes, you can't even tell where the leaven is anymore. It just sort of goes into it. It's a perfect metaphor, which is why Yeshua used it. So, you know, he's talking about how this can slip into things and more or less take it over, because then what happens? The whole bread obviously rises. And that's why, you know, if you've ever seen a matzah cracker that they use like in Passover, that's why they're so flat. It's because there's no yeast in it. There's no leaven. Now, there's a parable here that's very important to understanding the conspiracy. Matthew 13:33, all those huge parables are in Matthew 13, and Yeshua said this, "Another parable spake he unto them, the kingdom of heaven is like unto leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal, till the whole was leavened." Note that Yeshua is talking about the kingdom of heaven, not the kingdom of Yahweh, God. You ever notice that? There's only one gospel that uses the phrase kingdom of heaven, the Malchut HaShamayim in Hebrew, and that is Matthew. Now, most Bible scholars will tell you Matthew is the most Jewish of the 4 gospels, and Matthew is the gospel that was directed toward specifically the Israelite people. And so it's interesting because these are 2 separate things. The kingdom of heaven is the earthly Davidic reign of Yeshua and of you know, all the way back, in fact, to the first king, Adam, who blew it, and then the next king, Noah, who blew it, and every other king down the way blew it. Even King David blew it, because of course he, you know, had that affair with Bathsheba. So in all of these cases, we're talking about a kingdom. Now, on the other hand, the kingdom of Yahweh is the kingdom that is spiritual. So when we get born again, we are translated from the earthly realm of darkness into the kingdom of Yahweh. Whereas the kingdom of heaven is a physical kingdom which right now isn't on the earth. It will come back to earth when the king comes back to earth. And that's Yeshua, of course. But right now there is no kingdom of heaven, quote unquote. But at this time there was. And you see the danger of what this thing is beginning to talk about, this parable, is that this leaven business in the 3 measures of meal was about trying to falsely establish a kingdom of heaven here on the earth. This is a very mysterious and controversial parable. Now, what is exactly the kingdom of heaven? We already talked about that. But now, what exactly is the leaven? Well, remember what Yeshua said earlier, we talked about it. It's the doctrine, the false doctrine, and he was referring specifically then to the Pharisees. But it's false doctrine. Now, who is this woman? Who's the mysterious woman who's taking the meal and kneading it and dividing it up into 3 parts? And then finally, what is the significance of the 3 measures? Well, actually, there's several uses of the word woman in the Bible. I think it's always important to let Scripture define the words in Scripture. The Bible is our dictionary, amen? You know, if you want to know what a term means, you go through and you see it. Now, there's various symbolic uses on the deeper level of the word woman. One is, a woman is sometimes, let me see. Sometimes people will say, oh, it refers to the church, but the church is never called a woman, is it? It's called a bride, but it's never called just a woman. Okay, sometimes the term woman is used on a parable, or what's called in Hebrew a drash level of scripture interpretation, as a symbol of Israel, both bad and good. Sometimes Israel is the prophets will say the virgin daughter of Israel, and that's of course a good reference, or when Israel is being seen as being virtuous and righteous. And then sometimes, I hate to say this, Israel is portrayed as virtually like a prostitute or a woman of ill repute. So, it could go either way. Then there's another use of the word woman in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, which is in Revelation 17. I'm sure many of you know this. A woman, he saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-covered beast full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints, and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. Well, wouldn't you? What an image. And of course, you can get at all kinds of different things about who is this woman, what is Babylon. I mean, there's different versions of that. But the important thing is it's a symbol of spiritual wickedness and deception. And she's going to be prominent in the last days. And how many of you realize we're in the last days? Amen? Okay. Now, we got to divide up the chametz. First of all, leaven is sin or bad doctrine. Now, what is meal? Well, if you know anything about making your own bread from really seriously scratch, you know that meal is ground up wheat berries. I don't know if any of you ever done that, where you actually ground up your own wheat berries, but they look like these little hard things. You put them in a flour mill or whatever, and you grind them up into flour. Now notice, again, using Scripture to define Scripture, that Yeshua in that very same chapter defines wheat as the children of the Malchut, the children of the kingdom. So, if wheat is the children of the kingdom, then the meal is what has been, you can't bake bread with wheat berries, can you? It'd be real crunchy. You might end up with something kind of like popcorn, except not. The only way wheat is useful is if it's ground up. And similarly, the only way we are useful to the master is if we're ground up, is if we're broken and crushed and pulverized so that we can be of use to him. So therefore, wheat is the children of the kingdom. Thus, the 3 measures of meal would mean the 3 great divisions of Christendom as it happens. Now, isn't this interesting that this was said in the 1st century? And today we all understand there's basically 3 broad divisions of Christianity, quote unquote. First of all, there's the Eastern Orthodox churches, which are probably the most ancient. And the Russian Orthodox, there's what are called the patriarchates, the Greek patriarch, the Russian patriarch, the Syrian patriarch, etc. Then there's the Roman church, which you see there, I guess it would be on your right, and the Vatican City in all of its glory. And then finally, there's the various Protestant churches there on the bottom, symbolized by Westminster Abbey. So these are the 3 broad divisions into which almost all Christian churches fit. So I think that's what this is referring to. We can readily see how leaven, pagan ideas, and strange doctrines have swept into Roman Catholicism. Most of us understand it. I mean, they pray to statues. They have all these odd doctrines like purgatory and forbidding men to marry in order to be priests and so on and so on. To a lesser degree, some of these same ideas have also been mixed in with the Eastern Orthodox. They share a lot of the same strange doctrines as does Catholicism. They're not nearly as strange, but they still have a lot of that. And then the chametz, the leaven, has even been mixed in with the Protestant churches. Now how? I mean, you say, well, preacher, we aren't, our church, we don't have, little dollies up there at the front of the church and people genuflect to them. We don't burn candles to statues. We don't worship cookies. We don't do any of these things. How can we have leaven in our churches? Well, let's look at it. There's this mystery woman who's dividing up the three measures, and a term that may not be familiar to most of you called the klepote. The answer is found in the Western esoteric tradition, as it is fondly called, mainly Freemasonry. See, down through the centuries, from before even the time of Yeshua, there was this esoteric, just means a fancy word, it means hidden. Just like the word occult means hidden. This was something that was running under the surface. It was kept secret. You could not join any of these groups without an initiation. See, Masonry and its forebears is like a mystery religion. Unlike Christianity, I mean, anybody can walk into this church, for example, and sit and listen to a sermon. It's not like you have to take a blood-curdling oath or be blindfolded or be dunked in, a river of blood or something before you're allowed to sit in a Christian church service. No. But with some of these, like Masonry, they put you through various ordeals. In witchcraft, they put you through various initiatic ordeals, and so on and so on. Now, part of this system is what is commonly called Kabbalah. And some of you may have heard of this because it's really trendy right now. But it's important to understand the difference between Kabbalah and the klepotic systems that are generated from it. You know what Kabbalah actually means in Hebrew? It means to receive. That's what the word means. So if you're sitting here listening to someone teach out of the Scriptures, you are a Kabbalist because you're receiving something from the Scriptures. That's what it originally meant. And for thousands of years, it just was a deeper level of interpretation of the Scriptures. But see, here's what happened. As with anything else, the devil gets in there. See, in rabbinical learning, there's 4 ways of understanding the Scriptures, which I think this is biblical. It's called paradise. It's an acronym. There's the Peshat level in Hebrew, there's the Remez level, there's the Drash level, and there's the Sod level. And that's how you get paradise, P-R-D-S. Now, the Peshat level is when you read a book at its most obvious meaning, as historical or whatever. Then the Remez level is when it means hints, where there's hints of something deeper. And we can all think of examples of that, like for example, when it says in the Old Testament that that Yahweh gathers us under His wings. Does that mean He's a chicken? No. Or when Yeshua said, "I am the vine, you are the branches," does that mean He's a vegetable? No. These are hints of some deeper meaning. And then there's the drash level. You may not have heard that word, but it's just the Hebrew word for parable. And we all understand that Yeshua taught a lot in parables. And man, you want to see parables, look at some of those Old Testament prophets. I mean, some of those things, those guys said it's like they were, having LSD for breakfast or something. Then the final level is called Sod, and that means mystery. And of course, we know that both Paul and Yahshua and John in the book of Revelation talked about the mysteries of the kingdom. And what Kabbalah in its pure form was an attempt to understand those deeper levels of meaning. But here's what happened. See, for centuries, for millennia, the rabbis taught you cannot study this deeper level of Scripture until you are keeping Torah and until you are a good student of the Torah at the highest level. In other words, at the most superficial level. You don't try to do calculus before you can add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And that's what they were saying. And here's what happened. When this stuff started emerging into the common parlance in the 17th century, partly through Freemasonry, people started doing Kabbalah, but without keeping the Torah, without reading it, without studying, without being faithful to Yahweh. And so what happened, they slid into what is called the klepote. Now, what's klepote mean? Well, it can be translated either, notice this, in the light of the mystery woman of Babylon, it can mean harlot, or it can mean a shell, a husk. Now, this is the Etz Chaim, which is the original diagram of the tree of life in English. And you notice there it has 3 pillars. And this is what's funny, is if you understand what, like 2,000 years ago, these Kabbalists were saying, they were talking about the Trinity. They were talking about the Father, the Messiah, and the Ruach, the Spirit. You can use their writings to show that they understood that Yeshua was in fact the Messiah. But see, Satan twisted it. He got people to mess with this stuff who are not willing to submit to the commandments of Yahweh, who are not willing to do any of these things, and who are not even willing to study the Bible. So we get the tree of harlots, the Qliphotic tree. And I don't know how well you can see that. Again, there's a better diagram in my book. But what they did is, like, for example, what is the ultimate confession of both Judaism and Christianity? It's what is called the Shema. Deuteronomy 6:4. Shema Yisrael Yahweh Eloheinu Yahweh Echad. It means, hear, O Israel, Yahweh is one. The oneness of God, the echadness of God. Well, what's the top thing on this false tree? It's Thomael, which translates as the twins of God. See, the devil's number is 2, just as Yahweh's number is 1. So 18th and 19th century occultists uprooted the Kabbalah and tried to make it work with the occult. The result, they perverted it and slid into the Qliphotic realm, which is a very, very dark place. Believe me, I've spent years trapped in it. Now, there's another key component to understand. There's a line of thaumaturgy rooted in the Vatican. Now, whoa, that's a big word. What's thaumaturgy? Well, it's a fancy word for wonder working. For, like, taking a cookie and poof, you're Jesus. Or, for example, bleeding statues or levitating hosts. I saw all of those things when I was involved in the old Roman church. Rome is famous for its miracles. They used to have this statue of I think they still do. It's a Fatima statue. They trundle around the country. It's about yay high, and it's all dressed up in nice little dolly clothes, and it has a hat, a little crown on top. And if you're lucky, it comes to your church and it might weep. It weeps real tears. Now, that's a wonder. There's even a saint called St. Gregory the Thaumaturge, which in Greek means St. Gregory the Wonder Worker. And this is one of the lines that came in on this false tree. You see, remember, we already discussed this. You cannot have Satanism without Catholicism. Now, you say, that's kind of a bizarre statement. But that's because the whole foundation of Satanism is the Catholic Mass, is the idea of them literally believing they have the body and blood of Yeshua. And this is also the basis of the vampire cultus that I was a member of, that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, it's interesting, how many of you know that the person who's like the Jesus of the vampire cult is a Wallachian nobleman by the name of Vlad Tepes, Dracula. Probably heard of him by the name Dracula. And one of the reasons why he was believed to be a vampire is that he was born and raised Eastern Orthodox, but for political reasons he converted to Roman Catholicism. And in the eastern parts of Europe, and if any of you have lived there, you know these people take this stuff very seriously. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania. They used to believe that if you became a Roman Catholic, you would turn into a vampire. Isn't that interesting? Here's another interesting thing. How many of you have heard of the doctrine of incorruptibles in Catholicism, Roman Catholicism? They teach that there are certain saints, probably 100 of them or so, that are so holy, that are so wonderful before Yahweh, that when they die, their bodies don't corrupt. And they have, like, for example, St. Clare. Her body still exists somewhere in a church in Italy on display, and it has never rotted. It's hardly changed from the day that it was first interred. There's dozens of saints like that. And this is a sign of sanctity. Plus, there's a perfume that comes off their bodies. It smells like flowers. Now, isn't that's a wonder? But now here's the flip side of that. In the Orthodox Church, in the Eastern Rite of Eastern Europe and Russia, they teach that if you are a vile, evil, despicable person and or a suicide and or someone who becomes a Roman Catholic, when you die and are buried, you are so vile the earth will spit you up and refuse to decay you. And so your body remains incorruptible. So it's like, which is it? And that's where the idea came about, again, of the vampire being this incorruptible dead dude who rose from his grave to suck the blood of the living. Is again because they felt that this incorruptibility was a sign of being under a horrible curse, because they felt it was a natural part of the way things were, that when our bodies die, they decay and return to the earth. So you make the choice on that. But here's the thing you need to understand, is that the whole vampire thing as it's currently constituted could not exist independently of the Roman Rite today. Now, the other thing is we've got to talk for a moment about the Society of Jesus. Now, some of you may know that under another name, the Jesuit Order. What many of you may not know is it was started about 500 years ago by a Spanish warrior nobleman named Ignatius Loyola. That's why if you see Loyola colleges and Loyola high schools, those are Jesuit institutions. In fact, how many of you know that Bill Clinton was Jesuit trained? And you can tell. One of the interesting things the Jesuit order has is the doctrine of mental reservation. Oh, you know what it is, right? Mental reservation is the idea that you can say anything you want as long as mentally you're thinking something else. So it's sort of like you're saying, like with your hand, when you're a kid, you could make a promise that you had your hands tied behind your back, crossed, your fingers, then it didn't count. Well, that's this doctrine that it wasn't a sin for a Jesuit to lie if it was for the greater glory of God and if he had a mental reservation. That's right up there with what is the meaning of is. You know, you can see the similarities there. The apple did not fall too far from the clephotic tree, so to speak. Anyway, this Ignatius Loyola had some kind of an experience while he was recovering from having a cannonball shoot his leg. And then while he was convalescing, he felt called, quote unquote, to become a servant of the light. And he started this order, and the original name he gave the order was Los Ilumbrados. Remember, he was Spanish. Los Ilumbrados means the illuminated ones in Spanish. In other words, he called it the Illuminati. Now, this was well over 100, 150 years before the word Illuminati was used. Anyhow, he taught to the Pope. The Pope thought that wasn't a good idea, so instead they called it the Society of Jesus, because that sounds so much nicer than the Illuminati, doesn't it? But what's funny is if you study the Jesuits, as they are called, they are the most disciplined of the Catholic clergy. They're the most ruthless of the Catholic clergy, and they go through very extensive mental exercises called the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola, which basically teach you Hermetic magic. They teach you how to do mental magic, even though they don't call it that. In fact, one of the leading occultists of the 20th century, Dion Fortune, she was the most prominent feminine occultist of the 20th century. She said, if you can't find an occult fraternity or an esoteric order to join to learn how to do ceremonial magic, and if you happen to be male, join the Jesuit order. They'll teach you the exact same thing. So, anyhow, down through the years, you will find the fingerprints of the Jesuit order on much of Illuminism. In fact, what's interesting is one of the principles of Illuminism is you create these false oppositions, like, for example, Nazism and Zionism, or capitalism and communism. You create these false things and then you put them together and work something out. Well, what's interesting is very early on in the history of modern Masonry, Catholicism came out against it big time. And up until the pontificate of John Paul II, if you became a Mason like that, you were excommunicated from the Roman Church. Did you know that? But he removed that restriction, the last pope. What's interesting is the Scottish Rite is the most esoteric and anti-Christian branch of Freemasonry. of the two that exist in America. And there's a lot of evidence to indicate that the Jesuits helped write the degree work for the Scottish Rite. So even though publicly the Jesuits and the Masons are at each other's throats, privately the Jesuits helped create one of those prominent branches of Masonry. So here's these two magical currents. You'll notice the two red lines there going down. Notice there's three columns. And the one red column that is, I guess it would be on your right, is the false Cliphotic Kabbalah of the apostate Jews and occultists. And then the one on the other side is the Catholic current of apostate Christendom. But what's this middle pillar? What about that? Well, the middle pillar is the joining of the other two to form the chametz, the leaven of Protestant Christianity, which I submit to you is Freemasonry. Because Freemasonry is in most Protestant churches. I mean, except for maybe a handful of either very, Pentecostal type churches, and even they're not safe anymore. In a few fundamentalist churches, some of the real strict Lutherans like Missouri Synod and Wisconsin Synod Lutherans don't allow you to be a Mason. There's a handful of those groups. But for the most part, like the largest Protestant denomination in the world, what is it? The Southern Baptist Convention. Dr. Walter Martin used to joke that he said, he was Southern Baptist, he says, the Southern Baptists are growing so fast that by the time of the year 2000, there'll be more Southern Baptists than there are people. And the Southern Baptists will not condemn Freemasonry. More than half the pastors in the Southern Baptist Convention are Masons. And there's jokes about how if the Southern Baptists kicked out the Masons, there'd be only about a quarter left of their church membership. So these two things have come together, and the middle pillar, quote unquote, is Freemasonry and Illuminism. And that's why we have the problem we have today. This is what is called the doctrine of convergence. Now, in Masonry, especially in Scottish Rite Masonry, you're taught about the royal secret. When I was made a 32nd degree Mason, and you saw the certificate back a few minutes ago, I was made a sublime prince of the royal secret. My, don't that sound fine, though? Sublime prince of the royal secret. I'm a sublime prince of the royal secret, The funny thing is, if you ask a Scottish Rite 32nd degree Mason, what's the royal secret? I don't know. They might quote you some motto, like my hope is in God, which is the motto of the Scottish Rite. But they don't know. They don't know what it is. One Scottish Rite Mason in 1,000 knows what the royal secret is. But this royal secret has come down from the days of Nimrod, the days of Babylon, to this very day. And I'm going to trace out its path. You got the Babylonian mystery cults and Egyptian mystery cults. Why do I call them mystery cults? Because as I mentioned earlier, you were not allowed to just walk in the door and see what they're doing. You had to go through rituals, harrowing ordeals, and initiations. And both the Babylonians and the Egyptian mystery cults were based on what is a very common theme in all of this. S-E-X. Sex. Because these people worshipped the fact that nature, including human beings, could make more of itself. That was really neat. Like, wow, a baby, poop, there he is. They didn't get it. They in fact, the Egyptians originally were so out of it, they didn't realize that a guy was even involved in making the baby, because it took 9 months for the baby to get done in the oven and emerge, So they thought this was a great miracle, and it is a great miracle. But again, like Paul says in Romans 1, they're worshiping the creature rather than the creator. But that's why if you look all over Egypt, for example, you'll see pyramids, you'll see obelisks. What's an obelisk? Well, look at the Washington Monument. That's an obelisk. Look at the thing that's in the center of St. Peter's Square. It's an obelisk. It's a symbol of the male organ. And that's what they worship down through the centuries. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Then there's the Cliphotic mystery religion that started about 100 BC. And then right about the time Christianity was just gathering steam, along came these Gnostic mystery religions. Now, what's Gnostic mean? Well, it comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. And Gnostics were people who believed you had to be saved by secret knowledge. They thought that the simple gospel, as presented by John and Paul and the apostles, oh, that was too easy. They said to themselves, any doofus could do that. And these were Greeks. You know, the Greeks, they were really puffed up about how smart they were. I mean, they had Socrates, they had Plato, they had, you know, Euripides. You know, you've heard the joke about the Greek tailor. He says, Euripides, Eumenides. Sorry. I'll try not to do that again. Anyway, and so they wanted something real complex. And so they came up with this idea of all of these aeons and archons and layers of heaven, and just everything was super, super complicated. And along the way, the Gnostics also came up with the idea that matter was evil and that spirit was good. And so therefore they taught a heresy of Christianity that was technically called Docetism. Docetism taught that Yeshua never existed in human form. He just walked through earth like a phantom, because they could not conceive of a godlike being becoming a human being. That was blasphemy for them, because the flesh was evil. And see, that's why John, when he wrote his gospel, remember the first chapter of John? They call it the prologue. But that's a ringing indictment against the Gnostics. Because what does he say there in John 1, I think it's 1:14? And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. I get goosebumps just when I say that. Because, see, the word in Greek is logos. And the Gnostics put the logos way up here. It was this lofty thing right underneath what they called the pleroma, which was the fullness of the unknown deity. And that's right. Yeshua is way up there. But by saying the logos became flesh, Paul was basically throwing down the gauntlet, John, because remember, he lived a long time. John was writing his epistles way at the end of the first century, right? And so by this time, the Gnostics had started to come forward, and so that was his attempt to say, no, Gnosticism is wrong, Christianity is more balanced. Well then, after the Gnostics came along pre-Islamic sorcery and alchemy. Now a lot of people don't realize that Islam started in the 6th century, but before that there was this real strange culture of Arabs and Bedouins and whatever that existed in the Arabian Peninsula. And there was a lot of sorcery going along, a lot of alchemy going on. In fact, the very word alchemy, one of its meanings is from Chem, al-Chem, the Chem being a city in Egypt. So there was a lot of weird occult stuff and it's funny, even after Muhammad came along and brought in a kind of monotheism, there was still a lot of magical stuff going on. Then we have, around the year 1000, the assassin cult. Now this is where the steam really starts rolling in terms of the conspiracy. This was started by a fellow named Hassan-i-Sabah. Now Hassan-i-Sabah was called the Old Man of the Mountains, and he lived in the Alamut Mountains, in I think what is now modern-day Iraq, although I could be wrong on that. Anyway, he was the head of a sect of Islam that's still around to this day. It's a very tiny sect, and it's persecuted by the Sunnis and the Shia sects of Islam. It's called the Ishmaelian sect of Islam. And this guy was like its caliph, is the word they use in Arabic. He was its head. And he knew he had the whole world of Islam ganging up on him. And if he wanted to survive, he had to be cunning. He had to be devious. He had to be a conspiracy type guy. This is the man that's credited with inventing espionage. This is the man that's credited with inventing the idea of a mole. And by mole, I don't mean some little rodent that's out there digging up your yard. And in espionage, a mole is when you take an agent and bury him deep inside your enemy's organization for like maybe a decade, maybe 15, maybe 20 years, and leave him sit there. Everybody thinks he's fine, and then at a key moment, the mole comes up and somehow betrays you. Hence the word mole. And So here's how he did it. This guy had the first mind control cult. He had this beautiful castle in the mountains of Alamut. And he would, if someone wanted to join his group, he would invite them to the castle. And at this point, he would give them the most sumptuous meal imaginable. What he didn't tell them is that meal was laced with hashish. Now, hashish is a very concentrated distillation of marijuana. And it's fun. I've used my share of it, I'll tell you. I mean, it is it's a very powerful thing in that it makes everything taste better, feel better, smell better. You may have heard, like, people that smoke marijuana, they get the munchies. You know, they go through 5 bags of potato chips in 1 hour, you know. It's because everything tastes so good. Well, this is even more so. So he gives these people this stuff without telling them what it is. And it was his own special blend of Alamut hashish. And when they were thoroughly whacked out of their minds, he would have them led into this inner garden of his palace. And this garden was just gorgeous. I mean, palm trees, fruits everywhere. And there were these beautiful girls that were there to service these men in any way they wanted, you know, sexually. And when the guy started coming down off his high, he would bring him back and plunk him back at the table. And after the guy was sober enough to understand what was going on, he says, "Do you remember what you've just experienced?" And the guy says, you know, he says, "That is paradise. I have just shown you paradise. If you serve me, you'll go there instantly when you die." And these guys bought it. I mean, you think Osama bin Laden is bad. Osama bin Laden, other than he maybe has applied modern day methods to this, is nothing by comparison. This guy had an army of these people. And you know, one time his castle was surrounded, and the head caliph of another army came forward and said, "Well, if you surrender, we'll let you live." And he says, "No, you're going to surrender." And the guy says, "Why would I do that? I outnumber you 10 to 1. And Hassani Sabah went like this and snapped his fingers, and 100 of his men leaped off the parapets to their death, 1,000 feet, smiling all the way down, because they knew when they died they'd be in paradise with their 72 virgins. The guy fled. He didn't want to fight something like that. Can you blame him? And the other time that is recounted in history is that Caliph was going to storm the castle and try and capture Hassan. And Hassan sent him a note and said, "If you do not back off, you will be dead within a week." And the other Caliph just scoffed and said, "How can this be?" He says, "I'm surrounded by my most trusted retainers, my family members. You know, no one ever gets within 100 feet of me unless I've known them for years." The guy went to bed that night. The following morning, he woke up, there were 10 assassin daggers buried around his head on his pillow. This is a characteristic little dagger that the assassins would use. It looked like flame. You've probably seen pictures of daggers that look like this, you know, and they get into a sharpened point. That was their signature weapon of killing. Now, why is this called the Order of Assassins? Because they were called in Arabic hashishim. And the word hashishim, meaning eaters of hashish, became corrupted into assassins. That's where our word assassin comes from today. So, this organization, obviously this guy was a master at mind manipulation, at the use of drugs, at the use of sexuality, at the use of military training to create virtual robots. Now along comes another group, the Templars. Now the Templars were a very different kind of organization. They were a military order of knights that were started by the Pope to fight in the Crusades. Because what happened was, as some of you probably know, the Saracens and the Muslims came in and took over the holy city of Jerusalem. And so naturally the Pope had to mount an army and go and try and get it back, and that was a total disaster in the long run. But anyway, part of what came up were these Knights Templar. And they were a group of supposed warrior monks who took vows of poverty, and it was their job. They were known as the Knights of St. John of the Temple of Jerusalem. And it was their job to supposedly shepherd the pilgrims that were going to the Holy Land to worship at the holy sites. How many of you ever found that in the Bible, by the way, that you have to go to the Holy Land and worship at holy sites and, like, you know, kiss the foot of the true cross and all this kind of stuff? Did you ever find that in the scriptures? Not me either. No, I somehow missed that. Anyway, but the funny thing was is that originally there were only 9 knights in the Knights Templar. Now, how would 9 knights be able to guard all these pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land? A lot of people believe their real purpose was to try and dig in the ruins of the Temple of Jerusalem and find ancient mysteries, ancient secrets, and ancient treasure. The other thing they did is they discovered banking. What a wonderful invention. Here's what they did. See, everybody traveling to the Holy Land from Europe was afraid that bandits would fall upon them and steal their gold and silver, a legitimate concern. So the Templars came up with this wonderful idea called the check. They said, we'll tell you what, in our Templar commandery in Paris or Munich or wherever, you give us all your gold and we'll give you a piece of paper. In this piece of paper, it'll be written in a special cipher that only a Templar can decipher, and it will tell you that this piece of paper is worth, say, you know, $500 in gold, even though there weren't dollars in those days. And then this person would carry this piece of paper to wherever they were going, and there would be a Knight Templar hospitallary along the way at key places, and they'd present this, and they could get some money to buy food or whatever. And then finally, when they got to the Holy Land, they'd turn in and get their money back. And of course, they made a little interest in the process. For a small banking, you know how you get these banking fees every month? Oh, a little fee here and there. They became incredibly wealthy. They became more wealthy than anybody can imagine. They were richer than the Pope. They were richer than any of the monarchs of Europe, even though they were under a vow of poverty. Explain that one. But you see, that's because the individual knights, oh, we don't even own the clothes on our back. But yet the order was wealthy beyond anybody's dreams. And what they did is, see, they started loaning money to the kings and the emperors around them. And one particular king, Philippe le Bel of France, was into them for a lot of money. I mean, big time. I mean, let's just say this, his Knight Templar credit card was maxed out. And he figured, plus they literally owned half of his kingdom. And so he decided he was going to take him out. And so he arranged when the Pope died to get a new Pope on the throne of St. Peter, who was in his pocket. And he could basically manipulate this Pope and have him do anything he wanted. And so he arranged that the Knights Templar would be arrested on charges of black magic, sodomy, pedophilia, and sorcery. And this went forth on October 13th. That's Friday. That's why Friday the 13th is considered unlucky to this very day. And they arrested thousands of knights and tortured them. They were accused of all of these things. And it's hard to totally separate what's, because obviously if you're torturing somebody, you can pretty much get them to say anything you want them to. But some things, even in England where they weren't tortured, they taught about how they worshipped a deity called Baphomet, which was variously described as either being a skull or being a goat-headed man or being a three-faced head. And to this day, the origin of the name Baphomet is somewhat mysterious. Some people even say it's a corruption of the name Muhammad, which is one way of saying Muhammad. But nobody knows for sure. Some have speculated among the esoteric people, the magicians and sorcerers, that it means son of Mithra, Bapho-Mitra. And Mithra was a false Christ figure that was running around in the days of the apostles back in the first century. And the Mithra cult was going right along with the beginning stages of the believers in Yeshua, but it died out, and of course the church grew. Well, what happened was the last Knight Templar Grand Master was captured in this raid that went all over Europe. His name was Jacques de Molay, and some of you may recognize that name as being a name of a youth order in Masonry. And he was tortured, and he and his, I forget what the guy's name was, who was like his right-hand man, were finally condemned to be burned at the stake. And as they were being burned at the stake, he hurled a curse at the King of France and at the Pope and said, I now go before a tribunal far more just than yours. And you both will be joining me at that tribunal within the year. And both the king and the Pope died within the year. Now, some people say it was because of black magic. Some people would say it was because of assassins that slipped something naughty in the breakfast food of the king and the Pope. Who knows? We don't know for sure, but here's my point. While the Templars were in the Holy Land, there's a lot of indication they cross-pollinated, maybe literally, with the assassin cult. And they brought back a lot of these secret doctrines of the assassins to Europe, where it spread like a virus. Now remember, they were all driven underground, the Templars. Some of them, though, knew this was coming. They had some sort of warning, and the fabulous Templar treasure was loaded on some ships, and the best anybody can figure is that they sailed around the Mediterranean, through the Straits of Gibraltar, and up to Scotland, which is where they hid the treasure. And that's why today we have Scottish Rite Masonry. And in fact, you can go up today, and we've done this, to Scotland, and find tombstones that are almost 900 years old that have Templar symbols on them and Masonic symbols on them, which are very much the same thing. But for the most part, the Templars went deep underground, and they emerged about 150 years later in a different format as the Rosicrucians. Now, the Rosicrucians are another occult society, and I'm not going to get into great detail about them, except they're the brethren of the Rosy Cross. And the rose symbolizes the feminine mysteries, and the golden cross symbolizes the masculine mysteries. So we're back to this and that. It also has a sexual magical connotation, which I'm not going to get into. But the thing is, again, the Rosicrucians were the custodians of the same secrets that the Templars had, that the assassins had. And here's what's interesting. The very first time the word Mason appears in written English is in the context of Rosicrucian. In the 17th century, there's a poem called Muse's Threnody, and I document this in my book, Masonry Beyond the Light, where he says, "For we be the brethren of the Rosy Cross, and we have the Mason word and second sight." Now, what's the Mason word? Well, that's the lost word of Masonry, which is the great secret that's supposedly conveyed to you when you become a Master Mason. What's the second sight? It's occult power. It's an old-fashioned word for being able either to see the future or to be like a medium or something like that. It's called having the sight. So right then and there, we see three things knitted together by that quote: Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, and the occult. Okay, we already kind of dealt with the Jesuits. I'm not going to talk about them again. But what's interesting is that a crisis occurred within Masonry. Because originally, how did Masons get started? Well, they were a trade union. Very much like today, you have like the Plumbers Union or the Stonemasons Guild or the Carpenters Union. And think about it. Back in those days, hardly anybody read. Everybody was illiterate. You know? It's like the sign I literally saw this sign in Milwaukee on a school. It said, "Illiterate, write for free help." Anyway, the point is that nobody could read except a few priests and scholars. And so how do you know if someone's a Master Mason and is able to receive master's wages? Because they have the 3 degrees, just like I think, and I'm not a tradesman, but I mean, I know they have in many of these groups like carpenters, what they have, like an apprentice, and then you become like a journeyman, and then you become a master, like a master carpenter or a master stonemason, and you get more money. The higher up in the ranks you get. Well, it's the same thing in Masonry. You have entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason. And how do you know what the guy is? Well, here's what they came up with. Let's have secret signs. So, for example, if you show up at some cathedral where they're building some huge cathedral, because that's mostly what the Masons did, is they built cathedrals and they built castles. So you're at this cathedral, and you walk up and you say, "Hi, I'm a master mason. You got any work?" And the guy who's like the foreman of the site would say, "Well, how do I know you're a master mason?" And he would go like this. And that's the sign of a master mason. Or he might give a secret word. So, that's how it all started. And for centuries, that's why have you ever looked either in person or like maybe on the Discovery Channel or whatever at close-up pictures of these cathedrals? They're, first of all, masterpieces, but secondly, they're full of occult symbolism. Like to this day, nobody can figure out how they did the windows of Chartres Cathedral. The light that comes through those windows is just supernatural. And the symbolism, there's not a lot of Christian symbolism in most of these cathedrals. There's gargoyles, there's caryatids, there's demons, there's unicorns, there's all this weird stuff. You know why? Because those were catechisms in stone. You all know what a catechism is. It's something that you use to teach children or youngsters about the faith. I remember the Baltimore Catechism. Who is God? God is a supreme being, infinitely perfect, who made all things. I still remember that from first grade. And, you know, what they would do is, because again, these people couldn't read, is the old master mason, as he was getting on in years and to the point where he was thinking maybe his memory would fail, he'd take the young fellow crafter, the young apprentice under his arm, and he'd take him up to some place like the rose window of Notre Dame Cathedral. What does Notre Dame mean? Our Lady. And it doesn't mean the Virgin Mary either. And there's this beautiful rose window. And he would show this guy, the young apprentice, what all these different things mean. And he would explain it. All these esoteric symbols. And that's how it was passed from generation to generation. Because they knew these cathedrals in stone would last for centuries. And indeed they have. That's where the expression, you ever heard the expression sub rosa? It's Latin and means under the rose. And it's an expression that means to say something secretly. I'm going to tell you this sub rosa. That's where it goes back to the fact that the true inner secrets of Masonry would be conveyed under this rose window. So, the crisis that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago is the fact that the Protestant Reformation hit. Now, what was the big issue with Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation? Other than, salvation by faith alone, sola scriptura, sola fide, only the Bible, only faith. Well, it was indulgences. Because there was this clown, Johann Tetzel, that was his name, honest, and he was running around Europe raising money to build these awesome cathedrals by selling indulgences. And he'd go up to some rich guy, and he'd hear his confession. And the guy would say, "Bless thee, Father, for I have sinned. I committed adultery with, somebody." And he'd say, "Oh, that's a big sin. If you give me 500 ducats, it's absolved," just like that. And you could even murder somebody. That might cost 1,000 ducats. And this was a huge abuse, because it was taught that Yeshua, when he died, this is Catholic doctrine, that when he died, he laid up this enormous depository of grace, kind of like a Fort Knox of grace. And that then when all of these saints died, like St. Francis or St. Benedict or, whatever, that they were also better than they had to be. They were perfect. And so they raised up additional storehouses of grace to add to this huge pile of grace that's sitting up there somewhere in heaven in this bank vault. And the Catholics teach that the Pope, when he was given the keys of Peter to bind and loose, you all know that passage in Matthew 16, that's one of those keys opens up this storehouse. And so if you give money to Peter, to the Pope, he can unlock some of this grace and sort of poosh, dump it on you and forgive you your sins. And they were using this, you do that for the dead too, by the way, and the Catholic Church does this to this day. To the day my poor father died, every year he would have a mass said for his mother. Even though she'd been dead for like 20 years, she was a perfectly nice, sweet old granny lady. But sometimes 2 or 3 times a year, he would pay $25, $30 to have a mass said for the repose of her soul. So anyhow, the Vatican was raking in millions with this indulgence thing. Well, when Martin Luther came along and lowered the boom, and first of all, Westphalia and Germany and these various places in Northern Europe started jumping on the bandwagon, and then it was like the Roman Church was running like an old sock, because, we had Calvin, we had Zwingli, we had John Knox, all these different people. And all of a sudden, the church had to pull back this indulgent thing because it was really making it look bad. And so what happened? The funds dried up for cathedral building. All of a sudden, there were no more cathedrals being built, or very few. And then, all the Masons had left to do was build the occasional castle. And I mean, how often do you build a castle? I mean, it's not like you throw one up every other day or anything. So they were really hurting for money. And so somebody got the idea, let's start letting non-Masons, non-real stonemasons that are just lay people, let's charge them money and let us join them. And we'll teach them our secrets, but they don't have to actually be stonemasons. And this is where you see up there on the thing, around 1600, the division between operative Masons and speculative Masons. Operative Masons are the ones that actually know how to use a trowel and that can, lay a brick and all of that good stuff. Speculative Masons were being admitted at this time. And we'll talk a little more about this later, but they were basically philosophers and occultists and a lot of idle rich noblemen who had nothing better to do with their time. From that came, about 100 years later, it was getting kind of chaotic because there were all these lodges doing different things. And so in the Apple Tree Tavern in London in 1717, some bigwigs of Masonry got together for the English-speaking world and started the Mother Lodge, the Grand Lodge of England. And this is from where almost all the lodges in America get their warrant. Their ability to legally function is from the Grand Lodge of England. Then a few years after that, in 1773, we have the Grand Orient in France. That was a much nastier group. It was much more overtly anti-Christian. Then we have the Illuminati Ordinance, the Order of the Illuminati. That was in 1776. And between all these different things, remember I talked about the convergence, the fusion of the 3 pillars? Well, that's what came together in 19th century. So, I'm going to talk about Illuminism here. The Illuminati organization was started by a gentleman by the name of Adam Weishaupt, who was in fact a Jesuit-trained professor of canon law at the University of Ingolstadt. And he was a very brilliant man, and somehow or other, he got his hands on some of this Islamic mysticism and magic from the Order of Assassins. And he combined that with Jesuit mind control techniques and the secrets of Masonry, which we're going to talk a little bit more about later, and drug-induced states of altered consciousness. Remember the hashish. And he joined the Munich Lodge of regular Masons and worked to try and graft Illuminism into Masonry. And what happened there was in the 1770s is that they kind of grew together, Masonry and Illuminism, in Europe, to the point that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. And what he wanted to do, his goal, was to overthrow Christendom and introduce a system of philosopher kings, of which he would be the supreme leader, naturally, because he was the wisest guy on earth. And anyway, that they would reign as benign dictators over the entire world. This was his goal. The total eradication of religion, the total elevation of reason, because he felt religion was irrational. And he divided up into 5 degrees. You'll find a lot of 5s in Illuminism. And I was initiated into the first of those 5 degrees. The illumination he provided was gained through hashish, through meditative practices from the Jesuits, and put those things together to attain Luciferian consciousness, the same thing that happened to me. Underneath the surface, he was fomenting revolution. In fact, if you want to look at a case study of Illuminism, look at the French Revolution. And if you've studied the French Revolution, you know it was, well, it was even called a reign of terror. You know, the guillotine came out, it was a bloodbath. And that was partly because there was virtually no Christian influence, unlike the American Revolution a decade earlier, which was basically run by men of principle. Yes, there were Masons involved, certainly, and many of the founders of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons, but some were not. But because there was such a strong Christian underpinning in the colonies, the American Revolution didn't go south the way the French one did. And I don't know how many of you realize this, but as one of the climaxes of the French Revolution, they totally desecrated Notre Dame Cathedral. They shattered all of the vessels and everything because they hated Catholicism. And then they enthroned a half-naked prostitute on the altar, put a crown on her head, and crowned her the goddess of reason, and put a torch in her hand. And if you want to see what that crown looks like, look at the Statue of Liberty. Because that's a giant Masonic idol. And many people don't know that the Statue of Liberty was designed and built by a French Freemason as a gift to American Freemasons. And of course it's become such a hallowed symbol in our national culture, but the darn thing is an idol. And it symbolizes the goddess of reason who lifts up the light of Lucifer. So, you know, we need to repent of that. Anyhow, Weishaupt had this idea. His worldview, if you will, was very simple. He believed that if he could cause the kind of chaos that happened with the French Revolution, where thousands and thousands of people were killed, thrown in the Bastille, whatever the case might be, that he could produce utopia. And this was his plan. He divided it up into 5 levels. It's called the Law of Fives. The first in German was Verwirrung, which means chaos. And he thought that originally society was wonderful and pure and kind of in this Edenic state. Everybody was worshiping a goddess, and they were scampering through the woods, gathering herbs and, you know, fornicating their brains out and smoking dope and doing everything they wanted. And that was the Edenic state in which originally, supposedly, mankind existed. Well, along comes stage 2, which is discord. And this is when a ruling class emerges, as it always has to, and they take power. They start running things. And he saw this as the emergence of patriarchal religion, i.e. Judaism and Christianity, and people who are trying to take the fun out of everything. So this causes a resentment among the people that aren't on top, and they rebel, and that causes the third stage, which is confusion. Here people attempt to restore a balance between the 2 previous forces, to reprogram human nature to make it fit into stage 2, and this brings the introduction of a devil-like figure into the patriarchal religion. In other words, the monotheistic patriarchal religions have to make up a devil figure to blame everything on. So he claims that's where the idea of Satan came from. Then this leads to the most horrible stage of all, bureaucracy. Okay? The attempted synthesis of stage 3 fails, and a philosophy emerges where everything must be carefully tracked because the average person can't be trusted to run their own life. They need the government to watch out for them. And everything in their life is micromanaged. You know, they can't hardly, you know, go to work without having everything be monitored. And this makes people feel so meaningless and so frustrated because they feel like their whole lives are being watched over, that they start turning to drugs, alcohol, fantasy, or madness. And I'm reminded of a friend of mine who used to work at the Milwaukee Sentinel when I did, and he had this T-shirt that said, "I've abandoned my search for reality and I'm trying to find a pleasant fantasy to live in." And that's basically where this is at. you know. And notice today how many people are involved in fantasy, role-playing games, computer games, all this stuff where they deeply immerse themselves into this kind of thing. See, you know, that's where we're at, because we know we've got bureaucracy. We've got bureaucracy up to here. You know, everything is paper pushing. And of course, you know, since 9/11, it's gotten even worse. Anyhow, these people go crazy. They go on drugs. They end up in mental hospitals. They end up on the dole. And the middle class, see, everybody, whether it's Karl Marx or Adam Weishaupt, they all understand one thing. You got to get rid of the middle class. Otherwise, you can't have a real dictatorship. And so this bureaucracy thing was designed to sort of nibble away at the middle class. Just like that, you know. And that's what's going on today. I mean, it's harder and harder to run a business. It's harder and harder to do virtually anything. And people just get nuts to this. You know, I'm just going out and getting a welfare check. I mean, why should I go through all this stuff? And so without the middle class to generate capital, everything disintegrates into the final stage, which is grummet, or aftermath. Here the society implodes upon itself, goes back to chaos. The bureaucracy collapses of its own weight, and things whirl out of control. This brings back wild magic, and nature prepares the cycle to begin again. So he thought that he was somewhere in stage 2 and 3, moving towards stage 4, and that was his worldview, that was his goal. Now this explains the motto of the Scottish Rite. I don't know if any of you noticed on that certificate that I showed you way back at the beginning. See, you guys need to be taking notes. And on that certificate, at the very top, there was an all-seeing eye and a motto. And there it is. That's a little fuzzy, I'm sorry, but it says Ordo ab Chao, which means order out of chaos. And someday, if I get the time, I'll tell you about the sacred cow, C-H-A-O. Anyway, that's an icon within Illuminism. Anyhow, this is the goal of Masonry, is to create chaos and then bring order out of chaos, but of course to have that order be this benevolent dictatorship. Now for my two words, my two favorite words in the English language. You know what they are? But God. ... Fill in the blanks. What happened was, Yahweh had other ideas. In the middle of this, everything that was going great. What happened was, a courier, an Illuminati courier, was galloping through the night with secret messages to another, from Weishaupt to another person, I think it was in Austria. And you're going to love this. He got hit by lightning. You know, he had an illuminating experience. But God. And so this guy was found laying in this meadow, a total crispy critter, and there was a saddlebag full of all of these secret notes. And in them were all these plans to overthrow the crown heads of Europe. And so a warrant was immediately sworn out for Weishaupt's arrest. The Illuminati basically was kind of disbanded. He fled. Nobody knows for sure where he went. In fact, there's this, I think, totally apocryphal story that he came over to America, assassinated George Washington, and took his place. Because you notice how much he looked like George Washington in that picture? Of course, let's face it, folks, you put anybody who has a noble nose, you put a white wig on them, they're going to look like George Washington, amen? You know, but anyhow, there's that story. I don't put a word of truth in that, but anyhow. So, that was in 1785. The order was broken up. Now, notice what had happened here. This was a fusion of sorcery and statecraft. And that's brought even a higher level in the 19th century by Albert Pike and Giuseppe Mazzini. It has tooled Freemasonry and the conspiracy behind it into the dangerous machine that it is today. Now, how do you get to be illuminated? I'm sure you're all going to want to sign up after you hear this, okay? The first level is what is called adoption. Now remember this, the devil is a copycat because he can't do anything original. All creativity resides in Yahweh, amen? So once Satan separated himself from Yahweh, there's nothing he could do. He couldn't come up with anything, all he can do is copy. And so since he saw people having these neat born-again experiences, he figured, I want to do that too. And so he came up with this idea of adoption. Because remember, what happens when you get born again? You're adopted into the family of Yahweh. You're brought in to the body of Messiah. You're translated out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of his dear Son. And so Satan wanted the same thing. And so he wanted something that would legally make you his son, quote unquote. Just like when you get born again, you legally, juridically become a son or daughter of the living Elohim. So this is what happens when you become a master mason. You are adopted into the family of Lucifer, whether you know it or not. When you kneel at that altar and you swear an oath, and there is a kind of sort of low-grade illumination that's given every entered apprentice, which is the lowest level of masons you can be. You're kneeling at this altar, and you got your hands on the Holy Bible, square and compasses, even though at the time you don't know it because you're blindfolded. And the worshipful master is reading to you from Genesis 1:1. And when he comes, well, first there's a thing before that I forgot to say. The worshipful master, who's like the head of the lodge, he comes down from his throne and stands right in front of you. And he says, you're kneeling there, blah, blah, blah. He says, my brother, in your present condition, what do you most desire? And the fellow who's guiding you whispers in your ear, light. You say, light. And this actually happened. Some of you heard me tell this story, but real hot initiation one night in June. Very hot. No air conditioning in the lodge. We had this really heavy set guy. He's kneeling at the altar in his blue jammies, just sweating like crazy. I mean, there's this puddle of sweat around him on the floor. And we got to this point, and I was supposed to be the guy I was standing there to guide him. And he says, my brother, in your present situation, what do you most desire? And before I could say anything to him, he says, a beer. Now, mind you, this is in Milwaukee. Okay, so you can understand that. And of course, everyone, like that, you know. And I got down and he says, no, light. And the guy says, light beer, dark beer, I don't care, just give me a beer. True story. Anyway, the point is that you say light. And at this juncture, the worship master says, my brethren, assist me in showing our new brother the light. And then he reads Genesis 1. And what you don't know, you're kneeling here at this altar thing, is that there's like about, 10, 15, however many masons there are present. They're all lined up around you in a straight line, standing like this, which is the sign of an entered apprentice mason. And he says, when he comes to the point where it says, and God said, let there be light, everybody claps their hands together. They rip the blindfold off. And you see before you, totally dark room, just illuminated with a spotlight on the Bible and the square and compasses and 3 burning tapers. And that's a kind of very mild illumination. And then you're told that you're observing the 3 great lights of masonry by the 3 lesser lights. And if you care to know, the 3 great lights of masonry are the Holy Bible, the square, and the compass. And the 3 lesser lights are burning tapers, but symbolically, they're the sun and the moon and the master of the lodge, the worshipful master. And I love what my brother Harmon Taylor, who used to be the Grand Chaplain of the state of New York, said. He said, Yeshua is the only worshipful master. Anyway, so that's adoption. Basically, something is done to you. You make a commitment. And Masons, for the most part, do not understand this. But when you kneel at that altar and swear that oath, you have bowed the knee to Baal. Essentially, you have bowed the knee to Lucifer. And at that moment, you're adopted into Lucifer's family, even though you don't understand that. And again, that's how the devil does things, you know. Why should we be surprised? Well, the next step is illumination. And this is when you get to the point that you begin to see the light. This is done through drugs, this is done through meditation, this is done through trance work. and gradually you begin to acquire occult power. Your third eye is opened. That's up here, folks. It's called the Ajna Chakra in Hinduism, and it's believed that this is where you get the sight from. And through all these different disciplines, you gain these occult practices. And you can start seeing spiritual light everywhere, like auras and stuff like that. That's what illumination is. Then you get to the third stage. And then, at that point, you get into conversation. This is communion with the mighty dead. My, don't that sound fun? You know, you can talk to Plato. You can talk to Nero. You can talk to Aristotle. My, you can even talk to Jesus. Communion with the mighty dead. And these people come into you. They possess you. And the teaching is, the metaphor that I was taught, it's like, you know, when you buy a new pair of shoes, and even no matter how well they fit, you kind of got to wear them a while to break them in, you know. Well, it's like that with our souls. That these high-level beings, these ascended masters, these great archons of the universe come into you, and at first we're tight like a new shoe, and gradually they push us, they whatever, I don't know what they do, but anyhow, and sometimes it's literally they push us, and you gradually become more enlightened. Your consciousness is expanded. You become more and more enlightened. And I'll tell you a true story about this that happened to me. When I was going through some of this stuff, I had a very high-level spirit guide, doctor of divinity, come into me because I was also a trance medium. And this was a very high-level being, supposedly. And I was laying there, you know, with my wife because she was like taking notes and making sure I didn't freak out while I was in this trance state. And all of a sudden, I started breathing real fast, and my face started getting really red, and I was sweating, and I started actually growing physically. My body, you know, I don't know if you ever remember that old TV show, The Incredible Hulk, you know, where he'd start expanding and his shirt would rip. Well, I was wearing this, I felt so bad after the fact. My wife had made this beautiful velvet purple robe for me. And I just ripped out of it. It was like I hulked out. I swelled up like a tick. And my eyes were just turning red, and they looked like they were going to pop out of their sockets. And she was freaking. She didn't know what was going on. It was this high-level guide, you know, coming into me. But by the time that was over, I had streaks of gray all through my hair. And later on, these wonderful spirit guides told me, oh, well, that experience aged him 5 years. Now he'll die 5 years before his time. Gee, thanks, fella. I mean, I don't receive that anymore in the name of Yahshua, but, you know, that's how that's supposed to happen. After that, I was much more open to the awesome blandishments of the ascended masters. Well, then the next stage is Congress. And no, I don't mean the branch of government. This is a fancy word for sexual introitus, intercourse, whatever. Except you're doing it with the dead. And I don't mean with corpses. That would be too kinky, even for me. No, it means that these beings come down and they have relations with you, to put it delicately. And, you know, when that happens, what does the Bible say? You become one flesh. And so you're becoming one, and I didn't understand this at the time, you're becoming one with a fallen angel. You're becoming one with a celestial being. And I was actually, the ultimate of this is I was actually, a satanic wedding was performed, where I was married to the arch-goddess Lilith. And she actually came down, and how many of you heard of Lilith? She is a very nasty, very ancient, demoness, strongman type being. Maybe I should say strong woman. I don't want to be sexist. Anyway, and in rabbinical legend, she was the first wife of Adam. And he made her at the same time as he made Adam. Same way, out of the dust of the earth. But she wouldn't submit to Adam. Specifically, she wanted to be on top, to put it delicately. And Adam didn't like that. And he says, I don't like this woman. I want a divorce. And so Yahweh threw her out of the garden. And figured he'd make a more compliant partner, so he made Eve out of the rib. You all know that story. Well, anyhow, the story is that Lilith was pregnant by Adam, and she was enraged at having been thrown out of this wonderful place into this bleak land outside of the garden's precincts. And when she had the baby, she was on the banks of the Euphrates River, and she took the baby and dashed its brains out on the rocks, just to spite Adam and to spite the Almighty. And out of the baby's brains came all the demons in the universe. And so she's regarded as the mother of all demons, and she's regarded as the patron saint of crib death and abortion, sudden infant death syndrome. In ancient times, the Jewish people, if they were superstitious, even to this day, some of them do this, when they have a new baby, they won't let anybody know what the baby's real name is, because if they do, they're afraid Lilith will come and kill it. And they put a plaque over the crib that says Sanvi, Sansanvi, Samengalef. And these are supposedly the names of three very powerful angels that the Almighty assigned to protect babies from Lilith. And they believe by doing this that they will protect their baby from dying like sudden infant death syndrome or whatever. So, I got to marry this creature. I'll tell you, that was one heck of a honeymoon. Anyway, the ultimate goal, which fortunately I never got to, is what is called union. And that's when you've done so much of these weird things, so much of this congress with demons, so much of this succubus. You know, a succubus is a sexual spirit, a female nature. An incubus is a sexual spirit of a male nature that comes to you and assaults you in the night. I was well on my way to being totally insane. But what happens in the final state, the fifth stage, is your total consciousness is eclipsed by the demonic. There ain't nothing left, you know, just the demons. And you're just totally given over to evil. In deliverance, such a person is called perfectly possessed, quote unquote, that's the term. Although there's nothing perfect about it. What that means is, though, that the person's just so surrendered. I mean, I can remember doing this, and I'm so ashamed of it. I would get down on my knees and beg more demons to come into me. You know, that's how bad, because it was a high. Whenever a new demon would come into me, it was like a real rush. You know, more power, more wisdom. The two blandishments of the occult, power and wisdom. So anyhow, this explains, this last couple of stages, why there is such a level of unanimity among high-level members of the conspiracy. Because people always make jokes, you know, when you talk about this stuff. You know, conspiracy was, you know, the government can't keep secrets. Nobody can keep these kind of secrets. It's not possible, you know. But what they don't realize is what happens at that stage, at the fourth and fifth level, is you have these demons within you. And they can read your thoughts. They're living in there, you know. Yeah, they got a whole apartment house set up there. You know, there's probably, you know, 1,500 of them. And anyway, if you even start thinking of betraying some secrets, pain, they know just where the pain centers are in the brain. And they can give you pain like you would not even imagine. I mean, forget childbirth, forget kidney stones, forget, you know, having a white-hot poker run through your hand. It's like nothing compared to this. And so they don't even get to the point where they pick up the phone to call the New York Times and rat out the conspiracy. Either they die of a brain hemorrhage or they behave themselves, one of the two. So that's why there's such unanimity. And the only way you can get out of this is through him. Because, I mean, we've seen this. We've actually seen people who are in this group come to us for deliverance, and until we started seriously praying, you could actually, I mean, blood would start coming out of their ears. Their eyes would start bleeding. Their face would just turn beet red. It's like they were hemorrhaging all over their bodies because the demons inside of them were fighting. And we would pray, and ask the Almighty to stop that, and it would. Gee, what a surprise. Prayer works. Hallelujah. You know, because greater is He that is in us than he that is in the world. And I don't want any of what I'm saying here today to scare you guys. Because if He can save me out of all this stuff, you know, that's how awesome He is. But this also goes a long way to explain some of the monstrosities we see in human history. I mean, how could Hitler do the things he did? A lot of people agree, looking at him, he was a combination of being totally demon-possessed and also very strung out on, believe it or not, methamphetamine. Hitler was a meth addict. So that's why you don't want to let your kids get into that stuff. You don't want them, you know, acting like Hitler. Why Pol Pot? Why Stalin? Why all of these monsters that we've seen down through the last 500 years? People that just can kill 50 million people at the drop of a hat, like Stalin did, or Mao Zedong, any of these people. It's because they are at this level that there is no vestige of conscience, no vestige of humanity, just like you would think nothing of stepping on a mosquito or an ant, they would think nothing of wiping out Somalia. It's just that simple. So, you know, there's engineered famines, there's engineered plagues, you know, all these different things are being caused by this group. That's how nasty they are. So anyway, unfortunately it doesn't get any better. Satan's virus and the cult of the child. Masonry's beginnings in occult philosophy are documented by me and others elsewhere. But there's something about the lodge which has always attracted magicians, and if anything, this has gotten worse in the last couple of centuries. There's always been this profound link between Masons and the occult. I mentioned how these rich guys, these noblemen, these idle philosopher types, occultist types started coming into Masonry. Well, here are three of the most famous. Francis Bacon. Some of you may have heard of him. He's the guy that wrote The New Atlantis, and his goal was to have America become an occult theocracy. Pure and simple. Another one, a little bit later, was the famous antiquarian Elias Ashmole. Both gentlemen are English, and Ashmole is a very famous antiquarian. Two of them were the two most famous early speculative Masons who were also deeply involved in the occult. And then finally we sail across the pond to America to our probably most celebrated Mason, Albert Pike. Albert Pike was a worshiper of Ahura Mazda, which is the Persian god of light. He was very much into Zoroastrianism, which is the Persian religion, very much into Lucifer worship. He was also the highest ranking Mason in America of his day. He was a Confederate war general who was nearly tried for crimes, war crimes, during his tenure as a general in the Confederate Army. He also was the co-founder, along with Nathan Bedford Forrest, of the Ku Klux Klan, which started out as a Masonic auxiliary body. So this guy, and yet this guy is also the only Confederate general to have a monument in Washington, D.C. So that shows, even though the guy was a racist to the core, he was a war criminal, not just in the sense that the normal Confederate officers, you know, obviously they were fighting in a war, but this guy did atrocities and lost his commission in the Confederate Army because of it. But yet he still has a giant statue in Washington, D.C. He's also the only Confederate general to be buried in Washington, D.C. He's interred in the House of the Temple. And he's the one who made the famous statement, yes, Lucifer is God. But unfortunately, Adonai, quote unquote, is also God. See, that's dualism. That's Persian Zoroastrianism. There's two equal forces, a god of light and a god of darkness. That's what he believed. The historical list of occultists and witches in the 20th century reads like a who of the occult. These people are all Masons. Arthur Rudyard Waite, he was the co-founder of the Golden, he was a member of the Golden Dawn. Arthur Rudyard Waite was a Golden Dawn member and wrote several important works on Masonry. He also wrote the wonderful book, Black Magic and Pacts, How to Sell Your Soul to the Devil. Dr. Wynne Westcott and S.L. McGregor Mathers were the co-founders of the Golden Dawn Order, which was the consummate English-speaking occult society of the 19th century. Aleister Crowley was, of course, a very famous member of the Golden Dawn, who later on became infamous in his own right, and he used to say that an elephant would creak under the weight of all the Masonic honors I would wear if I wore all of the medals and banners and sashes that I'm entitled to wear. Dr. Gerard Uncos, the world's greatest living authority at the time of the tarot cards, known by the name of Pappas. His son initiated me into Illuminism. Dr. Theodore Royce, the founder of the OTO, the Ordo of Oriental Templars. Notice that word again, Templars, which was an occult black magic, sex magic society. Helena Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society. Annie Besant and Alice Bailey. You might say, wait a minute, these are women. I didn't think women could be Masons. Well, they can if you're an occultist. There's a branch of Masonry to which both my wife and I joined from the 1700s, came out of the French Revolutionary period. It was called Les Droits Humains, which in French means human rights. And it's also known in America as co-Masonry. And it equally admits both men and women to all the degrees of Masonry. So you'll find to this very day, most female high-level theosophists are also co-Masons. Bishop Leadbeater, a very prominent theosophist. Manly P. Hall, who is regarded as the most honored Mason of the 20th century. Gerald B. Gardner, who's the guy that brought witchcraft out of the closet in 1950s England. And Alex Sanders, who is known as the King of the Witches. All of these people were high-level Masons. And if you're watching this video or if you're sitting here right now and you're a Mason, I want to put it to you that you're linked to these kind of people. Because I knew many witches in my day as well, because these are all people from the first half of the 20th century for the most part, who were witches. And you're linked to them. And it says in Corinthians, we are not to be linked together with unbelievers. And when you are kneeling at that altar and making that oath that I discussed a few minutes ago, you have a cable tow, a rope around your neck, and you're blindfolded. After you've had this experience where your blindfold is removed and you see the light and all this, the Master says, remove the cable tow from around our brother's neck, because he is now bound by a much stronger tie to the fraternity. See, you're spiritually linked to all these creepy people, whether you like it or not. And you need to get out of that if you're a Mason. That's one of the first things that Yahweh showed me after I got born again, is I need to flee the lodge. Okay. There's a real reason for this strong link between Masonry and the occult, and that's because there's a concealed hierarchy within the lodge itself and within the Illuminati group. And it's there in plain sight, right on the Great Seal of the United States. I'm sure many of you have heard talks about the various Masonic and occult symbols on the front part and the obverse side, the reverse side of the Great Seal. There you see it. Now, I'm not going to go into a whole long thing about this, but what I do want you to understand is you'll notice the pyramid is incomplete. You see that it only goes up so high, and then hovering over it, there's this all-seeing eye, doohickey, the eye in the triangle and everything. Let me explain something. That ain't God. That is the God of the lodge. That's Lucifer. That's actually a representation of the eye of Horus. And it's hovering over the Great Pyramid, which is not really a pyramid, it's a trapezoid. Remember the trapezoid from way back in the beginning of this talk? A trapezoid is what? It's an unfinished pyramid. Now, what's a pyramid? A pyramid is a triangular structure that's a representation of the Trinity. See, this is an expression of Lucifer wanting to come down and take over the position of the Almighty. That's what he's wanted to do from the beginning, Isaiah 14, you know. So, concealed in this, though, see, the frustum is what a trapezoid is called in architecture. It's called a frustum. And this is the most sacred geometrical form in Satanism. And there it is on our dollar bill. There it is on the reverse of the Great Seal. The trapezoid appears frequently in Freemasonry. And that's because it's a symbol of the lack of, they think it means the lack of the Almighty. And so they worship it. And there's a belief within Satanism, which I have found to be true, that essentially the geometric space, which is most conducive to demonic presence, is a trapezoidal shaped building. Like, for example, a classical haunted house with mansard roofs, where the angles are out of true. And we found this in years of ghost busting, both before salvation and after salvation, that the typical haunted house will always have trapezoidal angles.